Yeah. So, how do we back out of an offer? And this applies to buyers or sellers, offerees or offerors. How do you get out of an offer that you've made? You can unmute if you like. Yeah, Samuel says communicate to the other side. Basically, revoke it. Basically, say, no, just kidding. No more. This doesn't apply anymore. We're backing out. There's no consequences to that. Can you back out of an offer if you've given the other party 3 days to respond and we're on day 2? You say, I want an answer to my offer by, well, let's see, we're on today, which is Thursday. I want an answer by Saturday at noon. And then tomorrow, Friday, you say, you know what? I'm done. I don't want to do this anymore. Okay, good. Good. You all know that. Yeah. You don't behold yourself to the deadline. You're beholding them to the deadline. Them being the other party. If you've made an offer or a counter offer, because that could be buyer or seller, the other party has to know, look, Saturday at noon, this thing dies. Do they have to respond by Saturday at noon? There's one of my legendary questions. It's like, wait a minute. He's tricking us with this question. What does this mean? If you're the buyer, does the seller, if you give them a noon on Saturday deadline, do they have to respond by Saturday at noon? No. What happens if they don't? The offer's gone. Yeah. Fell off the table, dead, void, no longer in effect. Sometimes people put deadlines on offers as almost a bluff. A buyer might do it really just to put pressure on the seller to not waste too much time in answering. But if we went past Saturday at noon, would that buyer truly not want to buy it anymore? Rarely. They rarely feel that way. They just want to make sure that seller doesn't drag it out for like a week or two. They want to put a little pressure and say things like, well, we have a backup plan. If this doesn't work, if we can't work this one out with your house, we have another one in mind, whether they do or they don't. Who knows? But it's just a matter of, if it got to Saturday at 11:30 and you still haven't heard from the seller, you as a buyer agent would have to have a conversation with your buyer. What are we going to do? Do you really want this to go away? Do we want to just tell them we're extending the deadline? And it might just be that a good buyer agent calls the listing agent and says, what's going on? Where do we stand? Because my folks need to make some decisions and we really needed that noon deadline today. And then if you find out that maybe they are trying to work some things out, decide some things, because what could be going on that seller side is they don't have a place to go. And they're like, I don't really have a house I want to buy. Your offer came in, they start looking around. They just can't find something they're in love with, and they're worried they're going to be homeless or have to deal with some kind of annoying transition that could be expensive between moving twice, like moving out of the one they're selling and then later moving into the one they're going to eventually buy because they don't have something to buy right now, which is quite often the case now. It's tough for sellers in that it's not so tough to find the buyer for what they've got, but they've got to turn around and find something to buy themselves, and now they're in the buyer's shoes. So that can be awkward. So rescinding that offer before the deadline, that's okay. That was the original question. What about backing out of the contract? What if the buyer backs out of the contract during the due diligence period? What are the remedies available to the seller if the buyer chooses not to buy it, backs out of the contract before that due diligence deadline? Before the due diligence deadline, what happens? Yeah, who keeps what? Who gets what money? Careful about that. That is a easy misconception. If we go under contract, we have a due diligence period. That buyer had to write a due diligence check to the seller, and it is given to the seller, and it's due on the effective date of the contract. So it's pretty much due that first day we've gone under contract. That buyer decides to back out, let's say right here, we're in the due diligence period. What they're losing, the buyer still loses. They are still out the due diligence money. They're not getting that back. But they will get the earnest money back, hopefully. According to the contract, they will. But as we also know, the seller would have to sign a release of earnest money, and they might just decide not to, just to be difficult. Then it's kind of out of our hands as brokers. It's going to be between them to work out in court if they want to sue about it, sue over it. But what is supposed to happen according to the contract is buyer gets that earnest money back during this due diligence period. That's why I make the joke we should call it an earnest money period, because that's really what's on the line. The due diligence money is gone. That is non-refundable. Whether if that buyer backs out during the due diligence period, they're walking away from that due diligence money. You know, Ben, the brokers, would they go to court as well? Let me knock on wood real quick. Don't jinx my 26 years. I don't want to start that happening. But maybe, I think all's fair in litigation. So it might be that if you have some documentation, they would perhaps, and I'm just not an attorney, but I watch Suits and all the legal shows. But I would guess worst case scenario. Yeah, they might want your documents, might want your communication proving if they thought it proved the point that they're trying to sue about. Buyer loses due diligence money, but let's really focus in and really understand that due diligence money that is non-refundable. Even if what? Buyer walks away, chooses not to buy it, they do not get the due diligence money, even if, tell me some things. What could happen? What could be reasons the buyer walks away, decides not to buy it? I'm making some bullet points down here to fill in the blanks. Ooh, that's a good one. Yeah. That's an easy one to forget about. If hopefully their lender is so good, so on the ball that they figure out within the due diligence period that, look, your loan is never going to work. We tried. I can't find a loan product for your situation. I'm sorry. So yeah, not approved. Doesn't get approved for the loan. That's a good one. What else? Buyer walks during due diligence period. Still loses the due diligence money, even if their loan doesn't get approved. Because remember, there is no loan contingency built into the 2T standard offer to purchase and contract. That's what that means. Still losing the due diligence money. Let's just put a little reminder of the range of value of due diligence money. I don't know that we're going to get a lot of six-figure ones anymore, but here's just the ones I've heard about. Due diligence money, non-refundable out there in the world in the last several years, 2-3 years. Like last year, about 11 months ago, taught a CE class, and that student I always ask, and they said, yep, my own personal involvement of a transaction, the due diligence money was $400,000. That buyer really wanted it. They were tired of losing. I would bet the buyer had tried to buy several and lost several before they came around to this one. How much was that house? $400,000. They wanted it so bad that they basically gave the seller all the money here at the start of the transaction as soon as they went into contract. And that meant that they really probably didn't ask for any repairs. Oh, there's one. back to the original question, I'll give you that one. Another reason that a buyer could walk and still lose that 400,000 due diligence money. Now, I bet we're going to still see maybe 1,000, 5,000, 10,000. I think we're going to see them come in lower now. But who knows? Just depends on how bad and how rare something is that somebody's trying to get. What about another one? Found something better. Yeah, changed mind, found something better. Feels like the Family Feud right now. Give me changed mind, found something better. And then another one, any sort of reason just to, hey, we don't want to do this anymore because we choose not to. Because here's the verbiage about the due diligence period. You can back out for any reason or no reason. In the contract, that's what it says. Any or no. They don't have to have one. Good point. There you go, Keisha. Yeah. Finally, don't forget this one. Well, let me give you one more chance. What's one more process in the purchase process, one more phase in the purchase process that has to happen and does happen and then doesn't work out to the point where the buyer's like, nope, not happy about this. The seller won't make any adjustments. The buyer won't make any adjustments. So the buyer walks away. What am I talking about? Related to the loan process. What is that lender going to require be done? It's not inspections. It's one of the things, but that's not it. It's not quite. It's the other thing. Inspection, survey, and one more thing. There it is, appraisal. If it doesn't appraise, that really gets people. Like clients, when you first meet them and you're explaining how this due diligence and earnest money work and what's the difference, that appraisal one really floors them. You mean if the property doesn't appraise, that seller's going to require possibly that I have to pay over the appraisal? I can't even borrow more than that because the lender won't loan to me more than the appraisal. And that seller wants me to pay over appraisal. And if I don't, I'm walking away from my $15,000 non-refundable due diligence. Yes, that's what I'm telling you. That really puts them on alert. Really underlines for them the weight of the transaction. It's not just frivolous. We can't just be making random offers unless they can afford to lose these due diligence monies. Okay. So that's a big one in offer versus contract. Go back to our list. What else? Offer versus contract. Let me think. Okay, well, how about if the seller chooses not to sell? Seller changes their mind. We talked about if the buyer changes their mind. What if the seller is the one who changes their mind? What are the consequences to the seller for basically breaching the contract? It's a breach. They're not going through with their promise. The buyer has the privilege to back out for any or no reason, but the seller doesn't. Sometimes sellers get it mixed up and they think, I've had one tell me before, well, we'll go ahead and sign the contract and we might change our mind about selling later. And I had to put a stop and a pause in the conversation for explanation, make sure they understood. That could be a really bad idea. You need to really be sure before you sign this offer and make this a contract, because you can't just frivolously choose not to sell. Without what? What happens to a seller who chooses not to sell when you're under contract? There. That's right. That's right. Ben's on the right track. That's one of the things. That's a big one. Being sued for specific performance. That's the big one, because that's a unique property. Can't just go out and find one just like it somewhere and replace it easily. And then along with being sued for specific performance, that buyer could also sue to get back everything they've spent in their process, which means how many inspections did they have? Those could add up real fast. on a certain size house, certain age house, because inspectors will change their prices depending on how hard it is to inspect it. The older it is, the worse and lower and the crawl space is, the worse condition it is, the longer it takes them to inspect it, the more it's going to cost to inspect it. It could be anywhere from $600 to over $1,000 for an inspection. And that's just the basic one. And if that inspection reveals the presence of potential fungal growth, which is the nice way of saying mold, now we have to get another one, a specialist in mold. And that could easily be $1,000 because it's going to cost them $400 or $500 to get the mold person out there. Then if they want, the buyer just chooses to have the mold sampled to see what species it is or see what the content is. Air samples, you got to have one to compare to. So that's 2 air samples, the outside and then the inside of the crawl space. And then you also want to see what actual species. So let's scrape that stuff onto a petri dish and send that off too. There's 3 samples at $100 a pop at least. So that's $300 plus $600, where we're back at $1,000. Now we're $2,000 down for a basic inspection and a mold inspection. Oh, you wanted to add on termite and radon? There's another $300. See how that works? So that buyer could sue to get all that back. Plus, they went ahead and paid for the appraisal and the survey, and right. So it's a big deal. That's backing out for a seller in a contract. What about backing out for the seller during the offer phase? Same as for the buyer. That's a lot easier. That's just as long as you do it before it's accepted and communicated. Same level of ease that the buyer experiences when it's an offer phase. Co-brokerage versus in-house. Beware. If you are reading through a test question, if you've joined us in the last 5 minutes, what I'm going down through is a list I've been putting together of just red flags to be watching out for. I'm going to keep going, elaborate on it, and put it on Notion. It's already on Notion. Just so that you can scan it. Maybe it'd be a good thing to print off and have in the car when you're sitting there about to go into the PSI or you're welcome, about to take the final and the PSI. Just scan these things and think about it like we're doing now. Just kind of think. And you might even want to make some notes out to the side of it. Maybe make a blank page with some bullets and fill in the blank. Treat it like a study guide, just like I'm suggesting you do for the syllabus. What all do you know about co-brokerage versus in-house? Go, that sort of thing, right? And you might have it on the tip of your brain, but you can't think of it. And then don't give in. Don't go look for it yet. Try to exhaust each one, then go look for the ones you couldn't remember, right? So that process between thinking about it really hard, agonizing over it, and then going and finding it, that's what will teach it to you. That's what will cement it in your brain the best. Much more than if I gave you an answer key to it. I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to give you the list. So, co-brokerage versus in-house. If the question is saying things like, Sally, listing agent with ABC Realty, receives an offer from Beth, buyer broker from ABC Realty. What are we dealing with here, potentially? What comes to mind when they're both from the same firm? Yeah, definitely in-house, same firm. And because it's in-house, what's another D word, ABCD word, that is also a potential issue that this test question might be about? Yeah, there it is. Dual agency, which also means another form of dual. Could be designated dual. You're just braced. You're ready. You know what might be coming because you're like, oh, same firm. Here's what might be coming. And then just keep reading the question and then see what they finally ask you. But at least it'll put your brain in the space. What if it says Sally with ABC and John with XYZ Realty? Now you're thinking not in-house. This is co-brokerage. If it's co-brokerage, then it absolutely will have nothing to do with what? Keisha. I'm not supposed to call on students officially, but because that answer you just made is the same answer, I thought I would throw that out there. Yeah, same thing. Oh, this is co-brokerage, then I'm not going to be dealing with dual or designated dual, because only that can only apply to an in-house, right? Okay, co-brokerage versus in-house. What else about that? Really, that's the main thing. If it's in-house, beware of dual and designated. What if it's in-house? Um, you could have a listing agent get a call from a buyer, and that buyer says, I don't have an agent. And the listing agent goes into, well, we could do this thing called dual agency. I don't want to do that. I've heard bad things. I'll just do it myself. I watch HGTV. I can be my own buyer's agent. Can this listing agent help this buyer who has no agent themselves without dual agency? Can dual agency not exist if what we have is a listing agent helping the seller and a buyer calls them and says, I don't have an agent. I don't want you to be my agent. Can you help that? If you're the listing agent, can you help that buyer, that unrepresented buyer? Think about it flipped around. Yeah. Think about it flipped around. What if you were the buyer agent and your buyer wanted to go look at a for sale by owner? Isn't that the same thing? You have an unrepresented customer. It works both the same way. So you're a buyer agent helping a buyer. They like a for sale by owner. We pause, we roll our eyes. We're like, oh boy, here we go. For sale by owner. They're probably overpriced. They might be skeptical and kind of mean at first, but you're going to win them over because you build rapport and you're just that kind of great person. So you contact them. You say, hey, I'm representing a buyer. They like your house. They drove by it. Great. Send them on over. Okay. Well, first I need to take a look to see if it's something that they would like on the inside. And we need to also discuss my next question. Are you willing to pay a buyer agency fee? What's that? A commission? I don't want to pay a commission. That's why I'm for sale by owner. Well, you see, a buyer agency fee is partial commission. I'm not asking to list your house. I just have the buyer and I would facilitate the process. I would bring you the offer. I would even explain the offer and the process after that. If you wanted to accept it, if you wanted to make a counter offer, I could show you how to do that. But make no mistake, I am representing the buyer because that's your wishes. You don't want your own agent. You are your own agent. And by the way, welcome to the industry. I like to make that joke with for sale by owners. Glad to have you in the business. We're basically colleagues now. And you know what? You have more listings than most agents do right now because you have one. Congratulations. So let me help you as a professional, as a professional courtesy, since we're both in the same business right now. But I will be able to provide forms. If we work this out, if you decide to sell to my buyer, I would be plugged in and involved. But I could be a resource for you, provide the forms. I just can't represent you. So don't tell me anything you wouldn't want my buyers to know because I'm working for them. And usually they get it. They might have a problem if the price is tight. They might not have enough room in the money they want for it to also pay you, because here's how that works. What if they say, look, I want $350,000 for this house, and you want me to pay you 3% commission? Well, that would need to be added on top of the $350,000 so that I end up netting the $350,000 so that I can pay various things that I intend to do with my leftover money. Therefore, whatever that would be, let's see, we could do our math like we did on the seller net problem. 350, ignore all that scribble scrabble. 350 divided by no, we said 3, so 97%. We'd need to write it up for 368.24, 360,824. That makes it so that 3% of 368.24 lands the seller at the 350 that they want. And now they can use that 350 to maybe pay off their $280,000 mortgage, maybe pay a couple of closing costs here and there, and then have at least 60,000 left over to go do whatever it is they're selling to do. Go buy the next one. You with me? So you'd have, but what if the price, what if the house, we could write it up, what did that say, 360, I think, 360, 200, something like that. We could write the contract for 360, which has your 3% commission built in. But here's the trick to that. It's going to have to appraise for 360 with your buyer's lender. The amount that you've rolled in to bring up the price to, which therefore now has your commission built in, so the seller, FSBO seller's happy. That all works great as long as it will appraise. So sometimes the seller's idea of what it's worth is inflated because they're just basing it on their wish. I call the list price a wish price sometimes. So that's the kicker. Sometimes there's no room to put it on to the price that they want, and it all falls apart, or your buyer's going to have to pay you some of it. Maybe it will only appraise for $355, and you still are owed $5,000 more. Maybe you need to prepare your buyer. Look, we're halfway there. I told you from the start, and you could say this nicer than this. It's just more fun when I'm explaining it to sound mean. I told you from the start that I charge 3%. That's what I do for my expertise of being a buyer agent. Therefore, we got to find another $5,000. And that buyer may not have it. You might have to make a business decision. Do you do this for the long term, the relationship over the one transaction, and go ahead and just take it? I know. Keisha sums it up. Yeah, that's all the stuff they don't tell you in the class and on TV. Your money can go away. That's why I'm a big proponent of not negotiating down and be a rock bottom broker right off the bat, right? Don't bargain basement yourself from the beginning. You need to leave enough cushion for little weird things like this to happen and you to still end up with some money, right? Because what's the point? Yeah, I know you love people. You love real estate, but you also got to pay those bills. And that's, if we're all honest, and I know we all are, that's part of why you're doing this, because it's worth your time. You think that's you, and you correctly think that this will eventually be worth your time and effort of learning a new thing. Because it's going to pay you, and you can enjoy it along the way, because being able to work with people and all that fun stuff. But yeah, that gets awkward. Let me catch up in the chat. Let's see. Yeah. Okay. So that's working with a for sale by owner as a buyer agent. Well, it works the same way in the other direction. If you're a listing agent helping a seller and a buyer comes out of the blue, calls you on the sign, says, I don't have my own agent and I don't want one. The last one I worked with was terrible. That's not uncommon, guys. They come to you with that, which is great for building rapport, because you're like, you know what? I know a bunch of agents like that myself, and I'd really try hard not to be one of those, so I feel your pain, and that it kind of takes their guard down. But they've made their stance clear. You can still handle it the same way, just as long as you disclose to them and make sure they understand that you are at no point representing them as a dual agent. You are always the seller's agent, listing agent. They're going to push it. They're going to probably like you because you're just so darn likable. That's why you're gravitating toward this business. And that you're going to be helpful and you're not going to be a jerk. So you got to kind of keep them on track and make sure you disclose that, working with agents disclosure right off the bat. And this other form called it'd be an unrepresented buyer agreement, just making sure they understood, look, you're not for me, you're for them, but you can still help them. Because by helping them indirectly, you're helping your own client. Because if you are unable to help them, what are they going to do? It'd be pathetic. They would be paying some attorney for contracts. They'd be maybe going to Staples and buying the generic kind that don't really accomplish goals too well, maybe. And it's just much better, much more efficient and streamlined if you can give them the documents they need. And you're doing it as a courtesy. You're making maybe less commission, because that's the other thing. They come unrepresented. Are you gonna still charge the 6% you originally told the seller you would charge? Maybe. And that's nothing wrong with that. But now there's no other broker to share with. So do you get both sides? They call it both sides for buyer and seller. You kind of deserve something on both sides because you're doing a little bit for them. So maybe instead of 6 and instead of 3, you might charge 3 if you were only a listing agent or only a buyer agent. Or if you had to share that 6, you would end up maybe with 3, let's just say. Maybe instead of that, you say, well, I'll do it for 4, 4.5, 5, somewhere between 3 and 6, because you're doing more work between than you are just the one side if 2 brokers were in the mix, right? Now, all of that comes up, but yeah. So co-brokerage, this would not be co-brokerage. This would be in-house with yourself, right? Because you'd have an unrepresented customer on the other side. Executed versus executory. What's that mean? What's executory mean? Here it is. Executory. What phase are we in if what we have is an executory contract? You're right. You're right. We're not done. We're not finalized. And people misuse the word all the time. You're going to meet some old dinosaur agent when you get in the business, and they're going to mistakenly, incorrectly call the contract. They just went under contract. They're so happy. So let me get this executed contract over to the office. Don't speak up like a know-it-all. I know you wouldn't, but don't say, actually, what you have is an executory contract, not an executed contract, because you're not closed yet. So just the only reason you really need to, this matters, because you wouldn't really use that out in the world. This only matters when you see it on a test question. If you see the word executory, you instantly know we're under contract. We are not closed. So in light of that, through that lens, now let's read the rest of the question, see what they're asking. Mortgagor versus mortgagee. What is the mortgagor? Well, I guess I should say, who is the mortgagor? Who's the mortgagor? The borrower or the lender? Think about it. We're putting up the property as collateral. We're saying, I will agree to give up my property in foreclosure if I don't make payments like I'm promising I will. So if you're giving something, you're the OR. If you're giving the offer, you're the offeror. So you're giving your property as collateral. That's how you have to remember this. It is very natural. And I think I remember from 86 years ago when I was in pre-licensing, I thought mortgagor meant lender. It just seems like it should, but it doesn't. The mortgagor is the borrower because it's the borrower pledging the property as collateral, giving it up as proof that they're going to pay the mortgage. Acceptance and communication. So yeah, those questions where they give you the whole chain of events. Offer was made, seller countered, buyer countered back. The seller accepted that one and told their listing agent that they signed it. Do we have a contract yet? Seller has told their listing agent that they signed the contract. They've communicated to their listing agent that the contract, the last counter, has been signed. Are we under contract? We are not, because we haven't crossed the line, haven't crossed the net. The tennis net, the volleyball net, we need to communicate over to the other side. And so if we are, if we're here, buyer made an offer over to there, seller countered that offer, buyer countered that offer, seller accepted and signed, and we have a document with both signatures on it. But the seller only told their listing agent, so that's the only communication that has happened. We need to get that listing agent to tell somebody over here? What if the buyer is represented not by a buyer agent, but by a sub agent to seller? Is it enough when the listing agent tells that sub agent to seller? Are we under contract yet? Not yet, because this sub agent is to the seller, not to the buyer. We're only under contract at the point where that sub agent tells the buyer, communicates to the buyer. That's the big one. So that weird phrase that can easily pop up, selling agent, helping a buyer as sub agent to seller. Now, when you read that, I hope that's more clear. Hope you're like, okay, selling agent just means we're talking about the buyer's side. They're helping the buyer, right? And how are they helping the buyer? There's two choices, either as a sub agent to the seller or as a buyer agent. Which is it? They told us this one. It's sub agent to seller. So that means they owe some stuff to the seller more than to the buyer. It also might mean that they were operating as maybe an oral buyer agent, and the buyer wouldn't sign the written buyer agency. So therefore, they had to drop back and punt and change their role to that of sub-agent. Mailbox rule means the delivery of the signed contract. It is considered having been delivered and received by the other party once it hits the postal service, like the big blue box out in front of the post office. Theoretically, your mailbox in front of your house. You stick it in there and raise the flag. Now it's officially in the hands of the USPS, because that box, even though you bought it and put it in, belongs to them. By the way, when you choose to farm a neighborhood and send out postcards, don't touch the mailboxes. Don't open those mailboxes and throw your postcard in there. That's federal. That is not allowed. You can get in trouble for that. You can do the paper boxes, but that even gets a little tricky because then people get fussy. I've had it before where we delivered to the paper boxes. Sometimes it's a mailbox up top and a paper box below, and the wind blew them all out. And we look back down the street, and all of my face is just scattered throughout the street, and now I'm littering times 100 times a million cards. So anyway, that mailbox rule applies not for money, though, just for the signed contract. When did that contract get delivered? When it hit the postal service. Now, that's, we're talking about stuff that doesn't really happen that much anymore, because who's mailing things in snail mail? We're probably handling things with electronic signing, instantly emailed back and forth. Rarely are we postage stamping contracts to people. Maybe if it's out of the area and we need to overnight FedEx something. But the mailbox rule only applies to that. It does not apply and count for the due diligence or the earnest money. You can't let that earnest money go to the third day that it's due and then throw it in the mail, and it's not going to get to the attorney who's going to hold it for 3 more days, so 6 days after the contract, and that's not good enough. It doesn't count for the same thing, so the money doesn't work for the mailbox rule. Earnest money, we're going to talk about that more with license law when we review that, but that's due 3 days from, you got to put it in the trust account within 3 days. The due diligence money is, you'd be surprised how few agents realize this, because the way this really works in real life is that quite often, let's just say, what is it now? It's 6:20. We get to a point of agreement. We have a signed contract now. It just came into our email. We've delivered it. We've communicated it. So we are under contract now. We're the buyer agent. We're all one big team. We're a buyer agent team. And we say, okay, we need to get that due diligence money to the seller. When is it due? In the contract 2T, it says it's due on the effective date. That means we have 5 hours and 40 minutes to go till midnight. if my math is right. We better get it to the seller within 5 hours and 40 minutes. How are we going to do that? Can't we just mail it? You could, but then it definitely won't get to the seller by midnight. Plus, the mail's not even running right now, so it's not even going to go out till in the morning. You mean I got to hand deliver it? I got things to do. Well, you don't make the money until you close the sale. Things don't get done with being locked in until the money has changed hands. Yes, you are under contract, but right now, and since you're the buyer agent, you probably would care less than if you're the listing agent. But right now, your buyer could walk, and yes, any reason or no reason, seller could walk too, but there's no money holding your buyer to the consequence of walking. Yes, your buyer could walk for any reason or no reason, but right now they can do it for free because they haven't given up that money yet. So it's good to go ahead and meet somebody, go deliver it. But what happens in real life is agent calls agent, hey, it's 6:20. Is it okay with you if we just meet in the morning at Starbucks and I'll get that due diligence to you? And most of the time that's okay. It's only not okay if the seller chooses to not like it. And that's fine if they don't like it. They might have been burned. And you got to be sensitive to the seller's wishes because it's their call. The seller could say, nope, that's not good enough. I want my due diligence money as the contract reads by tonight, midnight, drop dead, no later than. What happens if you do get the earned due diligence money to them after midnight of effective day? You basically, the seller would give them written notice through their agent and say, okay, now you have 24 hours. And if you don't get it to me within 24 hours, I'm walking away from this contract. And that's not considered breach because you breached by not giving me the money. And then the agents are thinking, well, that's when you were going to get it anyway. Why are you being such a jerk about it? But that's just kind of how it works. You do need to know the potential ramifications and how that works. You're probably going to get it to them by tomorrow anyway. But according for the test, due diligence is due on effective date. We talked about this just, I think we covered some of that yesterday as a review. The loan estimate and the closing disclosure. Think about 3 days because it's sort of like bookends. We've got this loan application, which means an address was given to the lender. Got that up here. And then we have the closing day over here. So think CD closing day, 3 days to the CD closing disclosure. 3 days before closing, no later than 3 days before closing, got to have that closing disclosure to the buyer. Do you have to have the closing disclosure to the seller? No. It's not the seller who's getting a loan to buy the house. So this closing disclosure 3-day thing is all about the RESPA requirements. RESPA is about the loan. So closing disclosure to the buyer side, that's what needs to be within 3 days, not later than. What if we're today on Thursday, we were supposed to get the CD for, let's see, Friday, Monday, Tuesday. We're going to close on Tuesday and we didn't receive the CD yet. And we're finally, the lender has been ghosting us, ghosting our client, not calling back. And they finally say, and I've had lenders like that. And they finally respond and they say, sorry, we've been working really hard. We just can't pull it together. We're not going to be able to get that CD out until tomorrow. Guess what? We're not closing Tuesday. That resets the 3 days. Now Friday to Monday to Tuesday to Wednesday. Now it's going to be Wednesday because we don't close things on Saturdays and Sundays. And then back here in the beginning, 3 days from loan application, need to have the loan estimate to the borrower. So we see the 3 days on both ends of the spectrum there. All that is part of RESPA requirement. We as brokers, brokers can't accept kickbacks. That's a RESPA thing. RESPA says to brokers, look, don't make suggestions for inspectors or lenders or appraisers or surveyors because you're getting paid. You can't get paid a kickback because it dilutes the the reason you're doing it. You should be referring and suggesting vendors to your client because it's the best vendor who has proven themselves for your client, not because you're getting to pad your pocket. And then RESPA is also making sure lenders disclose all the charges associated with the loan. Because remember, before this LE loan estimate thing, what we had was good faith estimates, and they were all different formats. It's hard to read. Quite often I would have to counsel the buyer and say, well, let's go find all the fees. I'm suspicious why this lender has promised you a 3% interest rate when everybody else is 3.5% and 4%. And I'll bet if we read it, if you send me that good faith estimate, this is Neil from 10 years ago, maybe even 15. If you email that to me, I'll read through it and I'll find that there's probably some discount points that they're wanting you to pay to get down to 3% interest rate. And that's usually what it was. And then also another good testable thing is RESPA relates to all federally related loans. RESPA applies to all federally related loans. That includes conventional. Even though conventional has nothing to do with the government in terms of it's neither insured nor guaranteed by the government. It is overseen by the government as a result of the Dodd-Frank Act, as a result of the 2008 misbehavior. Since then, the government oversight includes all loan types, so RESPA applies to all of them. When we're talking about the different loan types, FHA insurance, FHA mortgage insurance, called MIP, the mortgage insurance premium, the downside of an FHA loan is that the MIP never goes away. The entire time you have that FHA loan, you're paying MIP. The upside of an FHA loan is you might not have been able to buy the house without it because it allows for a lower down payment, like 3.5% is the official low down payment level for an FHA loan. And also maybe credit score. You don't qualify under a conventional loan because the credit score has to be up a certain level. FHA allows for it to be lower. Or could be your qualifying ratios. We saw that the conventional qualifying ratios are 28% on the front end and 36% on the back. FHA, the back end ratio is 43%. So it allows you to have more recurring debt every month and spend more of your gross monthly income toward the house payment than if you were getting conventional. That might be your only problem. You're good on down payment, you're good on credit score, but you just can't get around the fact that your new mortgage payment combined with your student debt that you have to pay every month, your credit cards that you have to pay, anything you're committed to paying every month, car payment, you just can't lower anything. I had a little old lady run into that, and she could not get conventional because she had just bought a new car like a year or two ago, and her payment was, I think, $400 or $500. But how much lower could she only probably get a replacement older car and chop it maybe by $200. That wasn't enough to get her to the point she needed to be. So we ended up having to go FHA because we found a lender willing to move some things around and look at it in a different way. It's all about the lender's risk tolerance. And this lender was okay with more of a borderline, slightly over 43% than the other one we were talking to. Conventional PMI is pretty much the same idea as MIP on FHA. It's private mortgage insurance. It's an insurance product that protects the lender in case of borrower default. But that one can go away once you've attained 20% equity. So you could get a conventional loan, about time for a break, at, let's say you put 5% down. You need to bridge that extra, what's between 5 and 20%? 15. So you've got, you're putting 5% down. Their comfort level, the lender's comfort level is 20%. So you've got this 15% gap. That's what the insurance is covering. The foreclosure is going to take the house in the worst case scenario, but then we need to bridge this extra gap for private mortgage insurance. And that's what that policy is covering. So that lender benefits. They get to cash out that insurance policy because it was protecting them for this difference here. The difference between what they wanted you to put down, really, in a perfect world for them, versus what you really did put down. Let's put down a break. I'll see you in 10 minutes. Welcome back. Here we go. Last couple of items here. A VA person, a person seeking a VA loan, just because they're a veteran or a spouse of a veteran, they don't have to use the VA financing. They choose to because they want no money down usually, but as a broker, it would be a nice thing for you to counsel your borrower, at least get them thinking that, look, just because you qualify for VA, unless you need the 100% down or 100% financing, zero down, you're going to pay less in fees for a conventional loan over time. You pay for the privilege. You get the possibility of buying because if you need the 100% financing, choosing FHA or VA, whichever, in this case FHA, but best deal overall, life of loan type thing, conventional. So if you have great credit, something to put down that could be used in a conventional loan, your VA veteran borrower buyer probably should consider that. And I just point them to the lender and say, talk to the lender, tell them you're a veteran, but also get a quote for a conventional loan as well, so that you can see what your options are. Because just because you can do VA doesn't mean it's going to be the best all-around deal. And then finally, bringing us up to speed for Unit 17, which we are currently in, appraisers do appraisals. Brokers, we as brokers cannot call what we do appraisals. We got to call it either a CMA or a BPO. With that, let's take a look at where we left off. We talked about that. We talked about the fact that what an appraiser does is give a market value with that appraisal. We as brokers need to give what's called a probable sales price or a probable selling price. That's what we need to call it. So as a broker, I would never tell a seller, looking forward to meeting you tomorrow. I'm going to come to your house for the listing appointment. I'm going to come to your house and I'm going to show you the appraisal I've prepared where I give you the value of your home. 2 strikes, right? 2 things I'm not allowed to do. I would instead say I will share the market analysis I've done where we will talk about a probable selling price. And then also you probably should give that to them in a range. Don't tell them a number. Give them a range of value because it puts more responsibility on them. Because the first time a seller makes it sound like they're going to have it pristine and ready to go, and then you show up ready to take pictures and it looks like they just got home from vacation, and you've got to like move junk from one room to the next so you can take pictures of each room, then it takes 4 hours. It's hard to have like a professional photographer come in when things need to be moved out of the way. So they're going to hold you hostage to that price you gave them, your seller. If you told them, I can get $450 out of this if it's in great shape and everything is perfect, and then it's not perfect, but they're still going to expect you to get $450. So it's a good way to talk about that, good way to bring that up. The comparable sales method or the sales comparison method, where we're literally comparing other things that have sold. The subject property is the one we're trying to list, the one we're trying to figure out the value of, or I should say it properly, the probable sell price of. And we use at least 3 things that have sold, 3 comparable sales from the most recent possible, as recent as we can get. No more than a month, hopefully, but sometimes you just have to go further out. So those comps we adjust to bring them to the same level as the subject, and we're going to talk a lot about that tonight. We had just gotten through basic economic principles of value, the most important of which is this one, highest and best use, because that is what an appraiser's looking for. And we care what the appraiser thinks if the potential borrower is using financing. If they're paying cash and they're choosing not to get an appraisal, then the appraisal process kind of doesn't matter if they're not going to get one. And sometimes people who pay cash don't want to spend money on an appraisal because why? Why do they need it? As long as they trust the broker or their own opinion as to what it's worth and that they're not overpaying, there's really no point, maybe, that they think to get an appraisal. So they don't have to get one. You do if it's a loan because the lender requires it. But if there's no loan, and more frequently, there are cash deals out there where they save the money on the appraisal. But when there is an appraiser, they are trying to answer this question: is this property currently being used to its highest and best use? We had some others. Principle of substitution, the idea that two of the same thing are going to sell faster if they're lower than the competition. Supply and demand is a big one. Seller market versus buyer market. Conformity in real estate, your value is more protected when you look like the houses around you, the properties around you, because that gives proof that buyers have been willing to pay a certain thing for certain properties, certain level. You can prove it. Kind of like cars, much as I hate to say it. How do you shop for a car? You go see what similar cars of similar condition, age, amenities, packages, LS, LT model, whatever it might be, are selling for. Mileage. So not different in that regard. What do similar houses of similar age, condition, amenities, types of neighborhoods, surroundings sell for? Talked about the principle of anticipation. That can add value if something is coming down the road, right? Coming in the months to come, in the years to come. And that could also apply to roads coming through, therefore making things more convenient. Now McDonald's and gas stations are really going to be looking at this intersection. Principle of contribution says that sometimes things that you put in a property don't add value. They might take away value. Sometimes, more and more often, in certain price point neighborhoods, you drive through the neighborhood, you see the garage door open. I did that just the other night. My brother and his family, my little 5-year-old niece, and me and my wife, we met them down in Rock Hill, and we went to a big neighborhood nearby and rode through and looked at the Christmas lights. And one of my favorite houses, they had the garage door up, and it was like a cool hangout spot. There was no car in the garage. There was a flat screen TV on the wall with a cozy fireplace, video playing, and couches and games and stuff. That's what people do with their garages a lot of times. What if they had gone all out and taken down the garage door and instead built a wall with like a couple of French doors? First of all, hopefully they had permission from the HOA. But secondly, did that add value? I don't know. If people want a garage, then they're not thrilled to have the living space. And how well did they do it? Did they put in a heating and air system? Is it just cold right now because they didn't do anything to make it? Is it like kerosene heat of all things, which would be terrible? So all those questions come to mind. What did they do? Oh, they can't really brag about 500 more square feet if it's not heated square feet. So all those questions come to mind. This principle of contribution can hurt or help you. Competition says profits attract competition. And then the principle of change says it's inevitable. No condition remains constant. It's going to happen. So with that said, out of this list that we just looked at, which of these items is what the appraiser considers the most when determining the value of a property? That short-term memory is working great. I love it. Good job. Highest and best use. You got it. So that appraisal process looks like this. They gather up data. They're going to look for costs, things that were spent on the house, upgrades that were on houses, the subject property itself, because they're going to, what probably happens more often for an appraiser, they get the assignment. They do a little bit of research up front. They look up the tax record. They already see what it's selling for on the contract. And they do some research to see what similar houses have and are selling for. Then they schedule a time to go out and walk the property. They need to measure it themselves. They need to take pictures inside and out. Not a ton of them. It depends on the type of loan, really. If it's an FHA loan, they're probably going to want to, the lender's going to require taking pictures of the faucets running, the water running, and they're going to verify things like smoke detectors. And it just depends on the type of loan. But for the most part, inside and outside photos of some sort, they will note, they're not going to inspect it. They're not going to put on some coveralls and go under the crawl space, but they will look around to the same level as we brokers might. And that appraisal visit would probably not last more than 20, maybe 30 minutes at the most. Then they're going to go back to the office, and maybe not that same day, but at some point they're going to do the actual appraisal report where they examine what they saw in person and compare it to the comparables that they can find in the system. Where do comparables come from? Comparable sale properties. Comparable sold, let's say it that way. Sold properties, because the appraiser wants to compare it to things that have actually sold, because that's how much we know buyers were willing to pay for similar properties. And that's a testable question we'll get to in the slides here in a minute. Best comps to use when doing a market analysis or an appraisal, sold comps, because we know that a buyer has proven they're willing to pay for this much for a house like this one, right? So it starts with gathering all that data, income, expenses, income if it's an income property. The appraisal process involves looking at the real estate market on all levels, nationally, locally, neighborhood. Then they define the problem. What type of property am I appraising? And we're going over the appraisal process because we as brokers, while we don't call what we do an appraisal, we pattern it after what they do. We really try to, because since it needs to appraise to probably sell, because you're probably going to sell it to a borrower who's using a loan, it'd be smart to do our market analysis as similarly as what an appraiser would do as possible. That's also, by the way, why when I'm a listing agent, I change the showing instructions as soon as we go under contract. I don't want an appraiser to be able to go there without me. I don't want them to be able to make an appointment with the appointment desk, which is included when you have an MLS subscription, at least in our market, and then show up and be gone. I want the chance for them to have to interact with me because I'm going to go there. They need to call me to confirm the appraisal so I know when they're going out so I can be there. And when I'm there, I'm not going to slip them 100, try to bribe them or anything. I'm going to give them a list of the features and upgrades that they need to consider when they're coming up with the value. Because if I wait until after they do the appraisal and they didn't know about some valuable features and they appraise it low and the deal falls apart, it's much harder to appeal an appraisal once it's finished. Because the mess leading up to 2008 was due in part, there were just bad guys all around. Not everybody, but they were across all industries. There were bad realtors, agents, brokers, attorneys, lenders, appraisers. And so if you got a few of those together, people committing loan fraud, the appraiser would claim it's worth more than it really was. The broker would be in on it. The attorney would be in on it. And they're all working together to defraud the investor. Because remember, don't think of the lender and the investor as the same person or the same entity. The lender is pulling the loan together, matching it up with the borrower, putting that loan application together to then appeal to the investor through the underwriter, the lender underwriter. They're saying, look, we want to make this loan. And that underwriter puts their stamp of approval on it, but it's got to conform. So the investor's the one whose money is being borrowed. The lender's the one who is the middle person, right? So the property needs to appraise. We need to meet, I like to meet the appraiser out there and say, here's why it's worth what it's worth. Just not putting the pressure on them, just saying, here's a list of things that you might be useful. And they're usually cool with that. They usually welcome it if you're not a big salesy jerk about it. If you go out there and say, come on, really need you to come through on this one. Why don't you make sure you give it the full value? That's the wrong way to do it. You got to say, look, I just go and I say, hey, I'm Neil, I'm the listing broker, I'm gonna stay out of your way, you do your thing. And they're probably going to walk around the outside and measure first. Then they're going to come inside and I still leave them alone. At the end, they inevitably will come to me and say, I have a couple questions for you. They take advantage of the fact that you're there. They want to make sure they're correct on some property data, at which point I pull out that envelope, hand it to them, and I'm like, well, here's some features and upgrades that might be useful for you to know. And oftentimes they'll say, oh, well, this probably answers all my questions. And then I strike up a conversation. I'll say, I'm just curious, on a neighborhood like this, a house like this, and a neighborhood like this, what kind of value do you give for an extra garage, a 2 versus a 3-car garage, or brick versus vinyl? I'll pick something probably relevant to the house. Because if you ask people about what they're good at, they like it. And you're going to learn something from somebody who's better at it than you. And inevitably, if it all goes well, they're going to say, hey, here's my card. If you have questions about stuff some other time, just let me know. That's what I want. First of all, I want to make sure they give full credit for my listing. Secondly, I want a person in my database to reach out to if I'm having trouble doing a market analysis down the road for a similar price range type house neighborhood. So the appraisal process, what kind of value, what kind of method? In other words, what type of property is it? And so what kind of valuation method do they need to use? There are 3 of them. Sales comparison is one, income is the other, and cost approach is the other. Which of those are they going to use? They will frequently use all of them and then put more weight on the value they got from the method that fits the type of property the closest. If it's a single family home or land, they're going to put more weight on the price value they got from the sales comparison method. If it's an income property, they don't care about the sales comparison method as much. They're going to lean more toward the income approach, which we'll go over later. Then they're going to do the work, go visit it, go visit the property, take the pictures, come back, do the research, put the report together, put all that data together, and determine if it's being used to its highest and best use. What are some other potential uses, if applicable? And then the part of that will be breaking out the land versus the improvements. They're going to estimate the land value on the comparables, and the value by the multiple approaches. And then the reconciliation is pretty much the last step before the report. Reconciliation means I've determined that it's worth, let me show it to you this way. I've done the sales comparison method and determined that it's worth $250,000. It's the appraiser talking. I've done the income approach and determined that it's worth $275,000 because properties like this, when they rent out, they're worth this, and therefore, here's what it would be worth if you were going to use it as an investment. Then I've done the cost approach and determined that it's worth $295,000. Which one do we use? Well, here's what they're not going to do. They're not going to average them. That's not what they're going to do. They are not going to just pick one. What they're going to do is say, what is it? Why are they buying it? Are they buying it for income purposes? If they're buying it as an income property, I'm not going to ignore these other values, but I'm going to give more credit to this one. So I'm going to lean more toward it being worth $275 than $250, and $275 more than $295. So they'll weight it toward the one that's more like what the property's being used as. If it's not a rental property, but it's going to be an owner-occupied property, living in it by the actual purchaser, then they're going to lean more towards saying it's worth $250. They're going to say, I think it's worth about, say, $253. They're going to be further away from this number because it's not income property, and this is the value of it if it were income property. Another little side note is typically the cost approach always results in the largest estimate of value. Cost approach tends to come in the highest of all of them. Why is that? Well, when we go over the cost approach, you'll see what are we doing as the cost approach? Figuring out the cost to build new and then subtracting out for depreciation. So that cost to build new gets pretty big. And then how much are you subtracting to bring it down to the condition of the property we're talking about? It ends up resulting in that cost approach being kind of too high. So there we go. Reconciliation between the three methods. Never average them. And then the report is done, that formal written report that's signed and certified. Now we have an appraiser's opinion that they print out, that they send off. They send it to the lender. The buyer also gets it because it's the buyer who paid for it. And it's up to the buyer if you're going to release it or the information from it to the seller. All the seller has the business of knowing is if it appraised for enough to move forward. If it doesn't appraise for the sale price, probably going to choose to share it with them. But if it appraises for sale price or higher, they're just going to say it appraised, we're good, we're moving on. If it definitely appraised for higher than the agreed upon sale price, it's probably a bad idea to share it, that information with the seller, because they're just going to get mad that they're going to think they could have gotten more for it. That may not be the case, though. So here are those three approaches, again, as a review. Sales comparison method is when it's a single family condo, townhouse, that's also included, or land. We use it for the land if we're buying raw land, or if we're figuring out the value of land when we're doing the cost approach, as you'll see later. Anytime it's land, we compare it to things that have sold. The cost approach is for special buildings, churches, schools, public buildings, things that don't sell all the time that we don't have a lot of data for. And the income is all about income producing property. They use all three if they can, and they weight it, whichever one is most similar to the property, the subject property. They don't take the average. They use the median. They don't take the median or the mean. What they should do is put more weight on the proper one, depending on the use. So the sales comparison method, how do we select comparables? How do we pick three properties that are similar? They need to, first of all, be similar in when they sold. How recent did they sell? I might have told you the story of my second-time buyer. She was, I think, 28 at the time. Her parents were always involved, which is fine. It's great to have mentors. And her dad chimed in 3 days after we went into contract, unhappy that we paid $1,000 more than asking price. This was from like 6 years ago. We paid $195 we paid $196 and they were asking $195. And we had to beat out a couple other people. And he had pulled some comps and she was crying. She was on the phone with me and said, my dad's worried. He's telling me that I'm overpaying. What do I do? I said, well, tell me the comps. She sent me the comps that he was going by. Every one of them was at least a year old. They came from Zillow, which is fine, except that probably means they really came from the tax record. They were a year. One of them was 2 years old, basically irrelevant. And I explained to them, look, these aren't the comps an appraiser will use. Appraiser is going to use current comps, and I looked at those when we put our offer together, and here they are. And look, it supports our 196. Dad felt much better the next week when one down the street, very similar, closed at 205. He stopped giving his negative opinion. He was happy then, as he should have been, right? Picking comps, it's about most recent. And then it's also about geography. How close are they? If at all possible, next door. I'm just kidding. At least maybe same neighborhood. If not, if there's just no comps in the neighborhood, then you can venture out. But the further out you go, the more adjustments you need to make considering that. It needs to be similar as close as possible in age, location, design, characteristics. And here's the second bullet point. If what you're listing and trying to figure the value of, or what the appraiser's trying to figure the value of, is a regular sale, like not a distress sale, not somebody that must sell because they're late on their payment, then don't compare it to bank or distressed sold properties. That's in the MLS. It'll tell you in the MLS if it's a bank property, foreclosure, some sort of an estate sale. All of those things imply that it's a distressed property sale. And when people are in distress, they take less money. Therefore, wouldn't be smart to compare a non-distressed property, subject property, with comps that were sold under distress. 3 or 4 are usually enough to do the appraisal. Where do we get comps? Any guesses? Tell me, where do you think you'd get comps in this business? What else? What do you think's better? The best possible as a broker who has access to certain things. There it is. That's the best one. Things like Redfin and Zillow, the online aggregators of information, the issue with them is while they do pull from MLS, they also pull from the tax record. So when you get like an estimate of value, a Zillow's estimate or whatever it might be, if it's not there, they don't send humans out to take a look. There's no human involvement in their robot estimates of value. They're using algorithms based on tax records. What do we know about tax records? As an owner, we're happy that the tax record is usually wrong because it's usually wrong shows less square feet than they really have. Because you go for a long time and nobody from the tax department ever comes by and asks to measure the house. So I usually will print out the tax record on a listing appointment and show it to the seller and say, now, show me which thing is wrong because there's always something, right? The tax record usually has mistakes. And they're usually okay with that because it means they're paying less taxes. But if you're using that as in your algorithm, you've got incorrect information and you're giving people an estimate of value based on wrong data. That's why those online estimators are known to have a pretty significant error rate. So, best comps come from the MLS. You can get them from the tax record, but you don't have as much detail either. The MLS has a ton of detail, which is useful. But at the end of the day, all you're really relying on is what some broker or office person who was told by the broker put into the MLS system. You don't get to go walk these properties. You're just going off of the pictures they chose to put in there, which are going to be hopefully the best pictures they could come up with, although that's not necessarily the case. I see terrible pictures in the MLS all the time. But they at least probably don't show the power lines next door. They probably at least squat down a little more and let the tree hide the high tension power line or the landfill or whatever it might be. Yeah, they might show a garbage can and dirty laundry. I can't believe that still happens, but it does. But, you're already at a disadvantage trying to come up with a probable sale price or a value because for these sold comps, all you have to go by are the pictures and the description, the MLS data sheet. You might get lucky and find a video, but nobody's going to take the time to watch a video. You, a broker, might, but I doubt an appraiser would. If they're not comps in the MLS, then look to the tax record. You would at least get what it's sold for. But as far as how big the house is and the acreage, I wouldn't really count on it. I've seen too many mistakes. Register of Deeds could be also a source, but now you're talking about a lot of extra effort. And then that tax data is, if not flawed, at least limited. So the best comps are the most recent comps. Geographically close to the subject property, similar type. Here's another one. If what you're trying to estimate the probable sale price of is the one-story home, then pick comps that are one-story homes, single story, for a couple of reasons. We've got a single-level home and a roof compared to a two-story home. Both of these are 2,000 square foot homes. This two-story is 2,000, meaning it's 1,000 stacked up. Do we notice something here? A couple things. Number one, in my high-tech Photoshop skill level here, the roof that goes over a 2,000-foot single story is approximately twice the size of a roof that goes over a 2,000-foot two-story. So there's more value there. Costs more to build a single story because of that. It also requires a larger lot. The dimensions of the lot can be smaller for that 2,000-foot two-story because the footprint's smaller. It's stacked. You can't just put a single level on every single lot. That's why builders in new construction will put a lot premium usually on a single story. They'll say these only fit on some of our lots, and you got to pay extra for those lots because they're bigger. So that's the biggest reason for making sure you pick comps that are the same style. Another one is those properties that are like a tri-level or a split level like I live in. That's kind of a dated style of house. You're kind of always living on the stairs. You can't just go all day without going up and down stairs. It's great for exercise, but it's not the same as a single level or even a two-story. If you're in one of those two stories with the owner's suite down, you could go all day with never having to go upstairs. All you need is down there. And that might appeal to more people, right? A greater buyer pool. So single story versus two story versus tri-level, split foyer. Best practice, compare it to the most similar things. Similar size. All of these differences we're making adjustments for financially add an element of error, potential error, into the estimation. The more adjustments you have to make, the less accurate your estimate's going to be. The fewer adjustments you get away with, the better your estimate's probably going to be because you're not having to fool around with it too much. Similar amenities, updates, upgrades, upgraded baths and kitchens, modern appliances versus 20-year-old ones, hardwood floors, granite counters, some sort of siltstone or mica. So compare similar as possible. The other one is this. Who's this guy? Anybody know what this is? Football fans out there? The Heisman Trophy. And I show it because of the pose. You know, he's got the arm out there. He's got that arm. Where's my camera? Okay, there he is. He's got that reach because we need an arm's length transaction when we're picking comps. In other words, sometimes a comparable that sold was a parent selling to a child or a friend selling to a friend. Something or other about that transaction was not the same as what they would charge a stranger. If you're going to sell to your brother or your parent to a child, you might just give them a deal that you wouldn't normally give to a stranger. And so if you're comparing a subject property, trying to figure the value, pick a comp that has arm's length transactions that aren't like family to family, some sort of conflict of interest built in. I had one, and the appraisal came in $11,000 low right at the start of COVID. First of all, the appraiser he came in the house, but he didn't take pictures in the house. He just came in so he could go out the back and take pictures of the backyard instead of going through the gate. My poor seller was home with her newborn. Thankfully, her mom was with her, but he showed up unannounced. Didn't even make an appointment. I didn't even have a chance to meet him out there, or I would have. Secondly, he didn't measure it. That's unheard of. He relied on my measurement for his appraisal. I know this guy. I have him on my Facebook, and every time he posts something, I roll my eyes, and I'm like, oh, there you are again. And then he should have gone through the house and taken pictures, but he didn't. But he came in with a low value. On top of all of that, came in $11,000 low, and I believe we were somewhere around that 160 to 180 price point, maybe. Maybe it was 200. I think it was 200. Because they had paid 147 for it a couple years earlier. So one of the comps he picked was noticeably larger. I had seen it when I did my analysis, but I ignored it. I threw it out because it was so ridiculously low priced for the size. It was, first of all, a single level, and it sold for a lot less than it should have. It was another 400 more square feet. So different, and he had picked it so different that when I was trying to come up with ammunition to dispute it, I called the listing agent. of that property. And I said, is there anything unique about this sale? Because I can't really tell from the MLS, but it just looks weird that big of a house, and those are pretty decent pictures, would have taken such a low price. And she said, yes, it was an estate sale, ding, ding, ding. And the kids who inherited it sold to their friends. That's not arm's length at all. And this appraiser didn't even take the steps of calling this listing agent. I tried. I put that in my appeal and said, look, this is what I learned about this one comp you used. It was not verbal. I had to write it down and send it in. He did not change his value. The first step in the appeal process was, hey, appraiser, are you going to do anything different? Are you going to acknowledge what these brokers are saying? The other broker was on my side too, because the deal was going to either fall apart if the seller couldn't afford to come down $11,000 because that buyer couldn't come up, couldn't add more to their down payment. And he wouldn't. He would not adjust. That's kind of why I still have a grudge after 5 years. My seller ended up coming down the full $11,000 because he just wanted to get through it. It was a situation where he also wanted to hang on to the one they were trying to buy, and I kind of wanted him to fight a little more, but at the end of the day, you got to do what they tell you to do. And so I said, okay, well, we'll move forward. But that was annoying. That was just terrible. And yeah, I probably could complain to the appraisal board. They don't. The thing about it is, who's going to pay that other appraiser? Ben makes a good point. He says, could you just have another appraiser come out? Somebody would have to pay them. Also, the way we do appraisals now compared to before 2008, that whole Dodd-Frank Act legislation that overhauled the loan system, they changed the appraisal process. Before then, a lender could pick their own appraiser. The one that they liked, they could say, hey, we got another one for you. We're trying to do a mortgage, so go give us an appraisal on it. And then what would sometimes happen is if the appraiser came in low, the lender would say, you know what, Frank, we really need to make this one happen. Is there any way you could kind of redo your numbers? And is it really this much low? They would put some influence on that appraiser, and sometimes the appraiser would give in, and there was just too much room for fraud, frankly, loan fraud. So now there is a separation between the lender and the appraiser. They don't get to order the appraisal direct from the appraiser. When the appraisal is ordered, the lender does it through a third-party company, and that company reaches out to appraisers and says, who wants it? Who wants to do this appraisal in this area, this location? And somebody will take it, and they'll go do it. But the lender can't be in communication with the appraiser anymore. I get it. That makes sense. But that doesn't mean we brokers can't be in touch with the appraiser. Again, as long as we're not trying to bribe them. In fact, I told you about those designations, those letters you can get behind your name once you get into the business and get your post out of the way. Go ahead and try to get some designations. It costs a couple $100, then you renew every year, but you can call yourself things like a senior real estate specialist or a military relocation professional or a pricing strategy advisor. Well, that PSA, Pricing Strategy Advisor designation, is one of several available through the Realtor Association. And I've been through it. And in the course, they suggest that we meet appraisers out of the property. So I say all that to say this: it's okay to meet appraisers at the property. Just handle it properly, right? Don't be a jerk about it. But you're really fighting for your client's value, your seller's value. You can't really come up with an excuse as a buyer agent to meet them at the property. That's really not done too much. But the listing agent perfectly makes sense to meet them out there to let them in. Yeah, that's a good point. That big of a difference. But the problem is, what would it indeed come back higher? That's the gamble that people always are kind of into. So they're rolling all these questions in their mind. Ben says if he comes back 11,000 higher, the seller would probably be happy to pay for another one. You're right. If they would indeed come higher and make that much of a difference. So, every deal is different. At the end of the day, it depends on what the client wants to do. So whether it's an appraiser doing an appraisal or a broker doing a market analysis, here's how that works. Adjustments need to be made because no two properties are identical. And what we're looking at are features, differences, whether they are superior to the subject or inferior to the subject. That's what we're looking for. So we're comparing a comparable that has sold recently and nearby to the subject property. What do we not know between the subject and the comparable? What we don't know is what the subject is worth. We know what we hope it's worth. If it's an appraiser doing an appraisal for a contracted property, an under contract property, they know what everybody wants it to come in at, but they've got to justify it. They've got to support it with the data. And then for us brokers, if we're going in to list the property, we need to figure out what they should list at. Seller may not have any idea, or worse, they might know what they want to get out of it, and it might be fiction. They might be way off the mark and think that it's worth $280 when it's really worth $220. You've got to be able to support it and show them, here's what similar things are going for. So the mystery number out of these two, when you're comparing a subject to a comparable, is the subject property potential price. That's what you're trying to solve. What you do know is what the subject has in it. Square feet, siding, garage, all those things, acreage. You also know the same stuff for the comparable. And then what you also know is what the comparable did sell for. So with all of that said, when you make an adjustment for a difference like garages, you make the adjustment to the comparable. You do the math based on the comparable sale price. You never adjust the subject. You only adjust the comparable. You can't adjust the subject because you don't know what it's going to sell for. So you don't add or subtract to the hope for subject price. You add or subtract to the guaranteed absolutely this is what the comparable sold for price, right? Always adjust the comp, not the subject. Testable question, testable. The comparable is what you make the adjustment to. The comp 1 sold for $155.9, comp 2 sold for $157.1, and comp 3 for $158.3, and we need to add $5,000. We're going to add $5,000 to the comp, not the subject. And that's going to tell us, for instance, if comp 1 had a 1-car garage and the subject has a 2-car garage, we need to add, and a garage is worth $5,000, we need to add $5,000 to what that comparable sold for so that we bring it up to pretend that it did have 2-car garage like the subject does. So we're adjusting up and down, subtracting or adding the different amounts. Since we adjust the comp, the way you can remember that is you can't add or subtract from a question mark. The subject is the question mark. That's what we're trying to figure out. Here are comparables that cannot be used. We have access to the MLS. And in the MLS, it gives us sold data, what things sold for. Under contracts, that doesn't tell us what they sold for yet. That won't be revealed until it gets closed. When things are under contract in the MLS, we don't know what the agreed upon sale price was. Because if they reported that and the deal fell apart, which could happen easily because the buyer could just choose not to buy, then you've told the whole world what that seller was willing to take. Now when they're back on the market for the next buyer, they're at a disadvantage. It's not fair. So under contract listings don't reveal the agreed upon sale price because they're not closed yet. It's not a done deal yet. Same thing for actives. Active listings, things that are asking, things that are competition, things that are on the market, not sold, not under contract. That's all just a hope for. The list price is the wish price. They're just wishing, hoping they can get it. Now, hopefully the buyer will eventually show up and make an offer, and it'll be close to something that they can accept. So both of these aren't going to be on the appraisal for the purpose of making adjustments. We can't make adjustments to these because we don't know. Now, with that said, in real life, the lender does usually want to see a couple of actives and a couple of under contracts just to kind of compare and see what's out there as competition. But again, you're not making adjustments to these. They might show up in the report, but they're not the ones that you'd use to figure out the value with. It's really just for a purpose of the lender having an idea of the market as a whole. What we're trying to do when we make adjustments using the comparative market analysis is get that comparable property as similar to the subject as possible. So if there's a difference in garage, we're going to add or subtract the value of a garage. If there's a difference in siding, all vinyl versus brick on the front and vinyl around the rest, or all brick versus all vinyl, we're going to figure out the value of that and add or subtract it to the subject depending on if it is superior or inferior. In other words, if the subject has vinyl, so it's worth down here, if you can see my picture, vinyl, and then the comparable has brick, what do we need to do to that comparable to bring it down, to take the brick off, theoretically, and make it worth less? It needs to be worth less to match up with the subject. We're pretending the comparable has vinyl. So how much is brick versus vinyl worth? Let's just say $10,000 per side. So let's say $40,000 for brick house instead of vinyl. We need to subtract $40,000 from what the comparable sold for to bring it to the level of the subject. See what we're doing? The comparable is superior. We need to bring it down even because it's got more stuff of value than the subject does. And that's all we're doing for every single adjustment. What if the subject has 3 bathrooms and the comparable only has 2? Now we need to figure out the value of a bathroom. Let's say that is $7,000. What do we need to do to the comparable? Add or subtract 7,000. Which one? In order to bring it to the same level as the subject. Are we adding or subtracting when the comparable is inferior? Let's look at it this way. In my expert artmanship, we've got a subject property here. It's got 3 bathrooms. 3 bathrooms. 3. Comparable down here has 2 bathrooms. It is inferior. We need to bring that comparable up so that it is the same as the subject in terms of number of bathrooms. We need to add a bathroom's worth of value. So if this comparable sold for $210,000 and we know that a bathroom is worth $7,000, that means we need to add $7,000 to that $210 that the comparable sold for, right? Because we're adding a bathroom, therefore we're adding the dollars that a bathroom is worth. So theoretically, if that comparable were exactly the same except it had 3 instead of 2 baths, it would have sold for $217. You with me there? So knowing, and you could even be doing that in class, right? On the test if you want to. Sorry, the weird box is back. Hold your hands out and think, okay, subject is superior, comparable is inferior. We need to bring the comparable up, add dollars. And the same for square footage. And that's the most common adjustment. That's pretty much probably going to be on every single appraisal. If the subject has 2,000 square feet heated living area and the comparable you're comparing to has 2,300 square feet and the comp sold for $350,000, what do we need to do to that $350,000 to pretend it has 300 fewer square feet to match up with the subject? We need to subtract the dollars that equal whatever 300 square feet are worth. Let's say $35,000. Then we need to subtract 35,000 from 350. What's that? 325? 320. Something like that. 315. I don't know. My math is off today. We need to add or subtract depending on is it inferior or superior. It's what we're getting at here. So let's look at the next little point here, then we'll take our break. The most accurate value is going to come from finding something that doesn't need very many adjustments. So the best comps that match up the closest are going to make it a better analysis or appraisal, whichever one you're doing. Let's do a break. I'll see you in 10. See you in 10 minutes. Okay, we're back. Tell me your best guess. Do you think the Real Estate Commission cares if we do a CMA properly? That's something you could be disciplined for. Or even doing one. Do we have to do a market analysis as a broker according to the Real Estate Commission? Do they require it? Everybody's gun shy. Everybody's like, I don't want to make the claim. You know what? I was just thinking about it just now. The overarching advice for this test that you're all studying for, whether it's like a zoning law, locally versus state, or subdivision regulation, the strictest wins. So probably best guess on test questions that the Real Estate Commission might want. Probably the stricter answer is going to be the way to go, maybe, potentially. But yeah, the Real Estate Commission says you better be doing market analyses. Don't just go in there, throw something at the wall and see what sticks. And I bet a lot of brokers have been guilty of that these last couple of years because it wasn't that hard to sell things. The hard part was getting to be the one the seller picked. But as far as figuring out what price to ask, it kind of didn't matter. You kind of could just say, let's just see what we think it's worth and add a little bit to it and see if we can just get those buyers fighting each other. But that's not a normal market either. You still would have wanted to prove and do your research and see what it should be kind of ballpark worth. So yeah, the commission will hold us brokers accountable for not performing a market analysis in a competent manner, and we can be disciplined for that. Another vocabulary term to be aware of is this word correlation. Above the equals mark there, correlation. It's really just like an equals mark. It's just an equals sign. Once all the adjustments are made to the comparable properties, we're going to use those adjusted sale prices to determine the range that it will probably sell for. That's it. So you would have like a sorry, I did not just have a stroke. Oops. Maybe I did. There we go. You'd have something that looks like this. Subject property. Comparable 1, comparable 2, comparable 3. What we do know is what the comparables sold for. This one sold for $315. This one sold for $325. This one sold for $319. We'll make adjustments. We'll say, let's say the subject had 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, 2,000 square feet, a 3-car garage, brick, full brick, siding. And then we'll say comparable 1 also had 3 bedrooms. Comparable 2 had 4 bedrooms. Comparable 3 had 3 bedrooms. That's all you're doing. You're getting the details of each thing. Comparable 1 also had 2 baths. This one had 3, and this one had 4, and this one has 2,400 square feet, and this one has 1,900 square feet, and this one has let's call it 2,300 square feet. And this is a 2 and a 2. They're all 2-car garage. This one was all vinyl sided. This one was wood. This one was Hardy Plank, which is that cement composite. And then depending on the difference between each item, in this case, the comparable has 400 more square feet. So we need to figure out what a square foot is worth and multiply it by 400. What if a square foot is worth $115? Your research has shown that houses like these are selling for $115 per square foot. $115 is your chosen. Let's say, actually, let me re-say that. If they're saying that things are selling for $115 a square foot, you would not use that for your adjustment. When figuring out the value of a resale property, you would not use the full amount you would build it for new construction. You'd take a fraction of that. Depends on your opinion and your experience as a broker or as an appraiser as to what that number would be. But if they're selling for $115 a square foot, then maybe half, let's say $65 a square foot, is the adjustment amount we're going to use when we're calculating differences in square footage. $65 a square foot times 400. $26,000. So we're going to take this $315,000 that comparable sold for, and we're going to do what? Either add or subtract $26,000 to it. Which one? It depends if the comparable is bigger or not. If the comparable is bigger than the subject, what do we need to do with it? We need to bring it down, right? We need to bring it down from 2,400 square feet down to 2,000, theoretically. So we need to subtract. We're going to subtract $26,000 from what this comparable sold for at $315 to account for the square footage. All right, that's square feet. Let's see, what's some other differences? The subject has a 3-car garage. This comparable has a 2-car garage. What do we need to do to that comparable to bring it up to the size of the subject? We need to add. We need to go up. We need to add a garage. So we're going to add the value of a garage. And in your research, you have discovered that garages for houses like this in neighborhoods like this are worth, for adjustment purposes, $13,000. I should have just written it in the spot. $13,000 for a 1-car difference of garage. So we're adding. Oh yeah, let's make sure we remind ourselves we're going to subtract that 26,000 for the square feet. We're going to add 13 for the garage, because the comparable is superior in square footage but inferior in garage. And then finally, the subject has a brick front, just front, the rest of it's vinyl. The comparable is all vinyl. And so in your research, you have determined that brick adjustments are, let's say, $15,000 per side of brick. Well, in this case, it's only one side of brick, just the front. So we're going to do something with $15,000. Let me make some room here. What are we going to do with it? The comparable has vinyl. The subject has brick. We need to do what to the comparable in terms of the siding to bring it to the level of the subject? Tell me. Oh, is that we've got a comparable, and you can even break out your hands. You could say comparable's down here with vinyl. Subject is up here. It has a brick front. We need to raise that comparable up, add to. We got to add, right? Because we're adding value to it to put a brick front on it, theoretically. That's tough. It's tough to keep that straight, right? It's hard to keep them straight, and that's why I suggest the hand thing. Subject has brick, comparable does not. What do we need to do to lift it up? If you're moving your hand up, you're adding the dollar amount. So now that we have all three of these adjustments, let's just factor them into the price. Started at a sale price of $315,000. Let's subtract the $26,000 for square footage. Let's add the $13,000. for garage, and then let's add the 15,000 for brick. And so the adjusted sale price, instead of 315,000, it adjusts up to 317. In the grand scheme of things, they almost canceled each other out, didn't they? But it's still adjusted sale price for 2,000 more than what they really got, which tells us that the subject is worth, maybe based on this one comp, 317. You with me? Then we would do that for comp 2 and comp 3. And so that correlation thing we were just looking at means we get the adjusted sale prices of each of these. And let's see, let me make some room here. We ended up with adjusted prices for comp 1 of 317. Let's see, let me just pull from air and make some stuff up here. Let's say comp 2 adjusted out to 319. And then comp 3 adjusted out to, just for fun, 321. So on our listing appointment, we'd tell that seller houses like yours are selling anywhere from 317 to 321. Or we might want to even broaden that range a little more. But that's not bad. That's pretty good. And in real life, I would also accompany this information to them with pictures. I'm going to show them the pictures of the inside, because what also happens is people start, maybe they are a little more proud, unjustifiably proud of their property. They think theirs is worth more than everybody else. So I don't want to be the bad guy. I don't want to say, well, you're wrong. Those will look great. Yours looks terrible. I'm going to let them see it for themselves. So I like to just kind of scroll through the pictures of these comps. This one sold for $325 and adjusted down to $319. But let's look at it on the inside, guys. And we're scrolling and we're scrolling. They're like, oh, wow. All the rooms, it's freshly painted, because there's a remarks section on the MLS too. It says upgrades and things. Fresh paint. The kitchen counters were redone with granite. They're not the same old vinyl Formica stuff that we have that's chipped because it's 20 years old. And oh, look, they have a pool. Oh, look, they have a 3-car garage. And I'd have a 3-car. But they have full brick. Mine is just brick on the front. They're starting to piece it together. Maybe the 350 I thought I could get for mine is unrealistic. And I'm sitting there and I'm like, you might be right. Good. You've figured it out on your own. I don't have to be the bad guy. You've kind of seen it for yourself. Nothing beats somebody seeing it for themselves. Sometimes you even get you get a seller who's so hard to convince that you might even need to just take them with you and go look at the competition. Just set up some appointments to look at competing houses as a preview appointment, or you go and take pictures or do a walkthrough, something to help them understand, look, you're not getting 350. You're just not, right? That's the process of comparing, and that's what that correlation means, taking these adjusted ones and using them to come up with what we think that subject is worth. Now, the other thing here that we haven't talked about is the condition. From those pictures in the MLS, it's all you have to go by on the comparables. But what if that subject is like a hoarding situation? They've got stacks of magazines, they've got recyclables all over the place, they're just in the house. They've got 5 cats, and you can smell it. And you can see from the pictures, these comparables seem like they showed pretty well. So it's another time to bring up that point. Look, guys, based on condition, we might run into buyers that have pet allergies, and I'm not asking you to get rid of your cats, but we might take a hit financially on the price because people might just not pick yours because they're worried they might not get the pet dander out. It's time to kind of point to the comparables and help them understand what that means to the subject. Oops, can't really read that too well. Let me fix that. Actually, let me show you this other thing, and then we'll come back to this. Let's look at this one. I just made this up at the break. It's just one comp. We're just going to make adjustments for one comparable. There we go. Now you can see it. The subject property has 3 bedrooms. The comparable also has 3 bedrooms. The subject has 2 bathrooms. The comparable has 3 bathrooms. So is that comparable superior or inferior to the subject? Is it better than or worse than in terms of bathrooms? Superior or inferior? Tell me in the chat. Yeah, it's better. So if it's better, then what do we need to do? If we could just take a wrecking ball and get rid of something, or like if you ever played Minecraft, or yeah, that's probably the best example. If you could just delete a bathroom, you would be subtracting it, right? Oops. Sorry, 1 second. Let's try this. Good. We're going to subtract something. And so, based on our knowledge, and in this case, the test gave us some information. Off to the right side here, it tells us that a full bath is worth $9,000. So that means we're going to subtract $9,000 from the comparable sale price, which I have not put in yet. Let me give us a comparable sale price. Let's say that comparable sold for $415. All right. Need to adjust down for the bathroom difference. Next, subject has 2,000 square feet. Comparable has 300 higher, more, 2,300. So we need to do what? Again, the comparable is superior. So we need to subtract however much 300 square feet is worth. The test is just telling us that we're working with $115 a square foot. If that's what they give us, then use that number. So what's the difference between 2,000 and 2,300 square feet? 300 feet at $115 per. So we're going to subtract $34,500 to adjust for the difference in square feet. Next, the subject has 2-car garage and the comparable has a 1-car garage. So this is different. Now the comparable is inferior. Are we going to add or subtract a dollar amount to the comparable now? Tell me in that chat. Yeah, we're adding this time. How much are we adding? You tell me based on what you see on the screen. Yep, 1-car garage is worth $12,000. And then finally, the subject has a brick front, one side brick. The comparable has no brick at all. The subject, by the way, has vinyl on the rest of it. So the comparable is once again inferior, and therefore we need to add something. What are we going to add to make up for that brick difference? That's a side of brick is $8,000. We're adding $8,000. All right, you guys tell me, what is the adjusted sale price of that comparable if the actual sale price was $415? We're going to take that 415 and we're just going to go down the list. Subtract the 9,000 for the bathroom. Subtract the 34.5. Oops. For the square foot. Add the 12,000 for the garage difference, and then add the 8,000 for the brick siding difference. There it is. Good job, guys. 391,500 is the adjusted sales price of the comparable. Instead of 415, if it were the size and amenities of the subject with these 3 or 4 items that we've dealt with, adjusted for, it would have instead sold for 391.5, which in turn means the subject should be worth somewhere around 391.5. We're going to do this for 2 or 3 more comparables and then see what the whole range is. Then what I like to do is look at each comparable, the pictures, and see which one matches up with the subject the closest. And I'm probably going to lean more toward whatever that one sold for in my estimate of what this probable selling price will be. Always, of course, given the condition being reasonable, right? Okay. Now let's look at a couple more. I've had time to enlarge those. Subject property has 2 bedrooms, and the comparable property has 3. The estimated value of one bedroom is $2,500. According to the sales comparison method, the appraiser should do what? Here's what you could see. You don't have to do any math here. You just need to know what to do with the numbers. You don't have to pull out the calculator. You're just telling, are we adding or subtracting? And from what? To or from what? Subject or comparable? So what's the best answer choice on this one? Anything that says we're subtracting or adding to the subject is wrong. Yeah? Because we don't do that. We can't. We don't know what the subject's worth, therefore we can't add or subtract from it to it. Therefore, we can cross out A and B. That leaves C or D. And so what is it? Subject has 2 bedrooms. Comparable has 3. That means the comparable's better, superior. That means we need to make the comparable less than what it is, bring it down to the level of the subject. Down means subtract. We're subtracting. We're deducting $2,500 from the value of that comparable. Good job. That make more sense? It's surprisingly confusing, the adding and subtracting. And that's my weakness in math, is just simple little differences like that. I really have to double check myself when I'm dealing with something like this and just really think, wait a minute, what does this mean? Is it the opposite of what I'm thinking? How about this? We have a 2-car garage on the subject property. The comp down the street sold for $245 last month, and it has a 3-car garage. It's superior. Everything else is the same. All we're doing is adjusting for a garage. The broker figures that the value of a garage is $5,000. One garage worth of difference is worth $5,000. Why? How? They base that on maybe talking to an appraiser, maybe seeing what other houses are selling for and garages being worth and their experience. How do you get that as a brand new agent? You talk to your BIC, you get training, you do research, you do your own stuff and talk to appraisers whenever you can, take courses. I'd say as long as you have a handle on taking all your posts, I would take that pricing strategy advisor class through the Realtor Association. I don't get paid for telling you to do that, but I found it useful. I've taken classes I did not find useful, but this was not one of them. I think you would benefit from it. Okay. You will never, by the way, be able to just buy from somebody or find. There's no master list of what garages and square feet and brick is worth. It all depends on where you are, neighborhoods, markets, Raleigh versus Charlotte, Chapel Hill versus Durham. It all depends on too many things. So what are we going to do here? We know the comparable is superior. Subject has a 2-car, comparable has a 3-car. We need to bring down the comparable, subtract from it. So what does that mean? Comparable adjusted price is what? Takes that 5,000 off of that 245, brings it to the 240. There you go. Probable sale price of the subject property based on this one item is 240. Subject has 2.5 bathrooms. Another house nearby sold for 175 a week ago has 2 bathrooms. Everything else is the same though. The broker figures the value of a full bath is $3,000 and a half bath is $1,500. Now, I would rather this not be what I have here. I'm going to change it actually, but not for now. We're just going to roll with this. In real life, it is not the case that a half bath is worth half of a full bath. It's just not. It's probably worth maybe 60 or 70% of a full bath. But for our purposes here, we're going to go with what's written. So what's the probable sale price of the subject property? I'm going to give you some time to do that on your own, and then we'll talk about it. So here we go. Got our subject with 2.5 baths, comparable with 2 baths. That means the comparable is inferior. That means we need to add to what it sold for. How much are we adding to it? The value of a half a bath. Not the value of a full bath because it's not different by a full bath. So 1,500 added to the 175 is 176.5. There you go. There we go. That's the sales comparison approach. Let's talk about the cost approach. The cost approach is based on that economic principle of value we looked at. Oops, let me share it with you. Called substitution. That's what we're surrounding ourselves with in this cost approach. We're looking for the maximum value of a property based on how much it would cost to build it and then subtract for depreciation because the condition is not the same as if it were new. There are 5 steps to the cost approach. The first step is, you need to know this for the test, you cannot depreciate land. Land cannot be depreciated. You can't, it's still dirt in 50 years compared to today, right? So you don't financially depreciate land. You figure out what the land portion is worth. So let's say it's an old school building on 15 acres. You figure out what 15 acres are worth in that county, in that city, wherever, and just note that off to the side. 15 acres is worth $213,000 based on what? The sales comparison method. What other parcels of land have sold for? We adjust for the differences in acreage, figure out $1 per acre, and look at how similar those pieces of land were to this one. Location, what it's got available to it, what matters with land sales. Does it have water and sewer lines nearby, or is it way out in the country? Things like that. So first step of the cost approach, figure out the value of the land. Next step, figure out how much it would cost to build the building today. Current cost of constructing the buildings and improvements, separate from the land. Next, figure out how much that new value would be after 25 years. So that because the one you're trying to figure the value of is 25 years old. The depreciation, factor out, subtract out the depreciation from the construction costs. And then finally, what do you think we do on number 5? We've got an adjusted amount that the building and improvement is worth. What do we need to do at this last 5th step to complete this cost approach? Has something to do with the first step. You're on the right track. What are we going to add? We're going to add something specific. Because remember, we figured out the cost to build new and we depreciated. We subtracted an amount of money from that cost to build new. We subtracted the depreciation percentage or the amount. Now we got to add the land back in, right? So it looks like this. Add that estimated land value back to the depreciated cost and improvements to get the total value. So I'm going to show you I'm going to come back to this slide, but first let me show you something. I'm not sure if it's in this current book. It might have been from the last book, but you probably have a similar one in your current textbook. So we have land that is a lot that's 60 by 135. They're saying in this example that the value of this land is $450 per front foot. Oh boy, that's like a month ago. What do we do when it's per front foot? What's something worth if it's $450 per front foot? What's the full value of it? 60 by 135 at $450 per front foot. Do we care about square footage when they're specifically giving us a front foot number? No, we don't. We just need to get that 60 because the 60, the first one in the dimension, is the street length, street footage, the front footage. So 60 times 450 is $27,000. That's the land value. So we're going to set that off to the side there at the top. They're adding in the value of some site improvements like sidewalks and landscaping and driveway, and they're saying that's worth another $8,000. So land plus those improvements are worth $35,000. We can't depreciate those things, so we need to set them to the side. Now we're going to figure out the building. The building, to replace that building, it would cost $65 a square foot, and it's 1,500 square feet. That's $97,500 to build it new today. But we need to factor in the fact that it is old and needs work. So we're going to subtract depreciation, an estimate of depreciation from this $97,500. We're going to talk about what curable and incurable means, but you can kind of tell from the list here, physical depreciation, things break down over time. If it's curable, it means you can fix it. Might just be deferred maintenance. They should have kept it painted, but they didn't. Therefore, now it needs paint, maybe needs some wood repair. Painting is going to be $4,000. Incurable depreciation means structural stuff, deterioration. It's just, you can't fix it. Too expensive to fix, maybe, something like that. Another $9,750. All we're doing here is figuring out what the thing is worth. Doesn't mean that we want to spend $9,700 to fix it. Probably just need to knock it down. But we need to know what the value is. That's the point of this exercise. Something we're going to learn in a minute called functional obsolescence. Means it's like obsolete. You know what that word means. It means functionally obsolete. Doesn't work so well anymore these days. Something that occurs to me in a house that's kind of functionally obsolescent would be like a sunken living room. We don't really see those that much anymore, because you're kind of weeding out potential buyers who need a single level. They can't walk around too well. Maybe they have a wheelchair So you're not getting those as potential buyers. That's the sort of thing that we mean by functional obsolescence. $2,000 for that. Adding up those three numbers means we're going to depreciate this thing by $15,750. So subtracting that from the 97.5 means that we have a depreciated value of the building at 81,750. Second to last number on the lower right side. But since the building's not floating up in the air, we need to add back in for the land. And we're adding that $35,000 at the top back into the depreciated building's estimate of value, which tells us the cost approach estimates this thing is worth $116,750. Does that make sense? You're setting that land aside. You're figuring out the value of the land using the sales comparison method, setting it aside. The only thing you're depreciating is how much the building would cost to build new. Here's what it looks like I just kind of talked our way through it, but I'm circling stuff here. Now, reproduction cost versus replacement cost. When it comes to these estimates, this is a big difference. Think about a historic district. Anybody been to a downtown area and you saw the nice old houses, the historic homes, and you're like, there's so much of these, and they're clearly at least like 80 to 100 years old, probably the historic district. Remember in zoning, we talked about a residential zoning overlaid by historic zoning. Well, those historic houses are in the historic district. That means that you can't just throw up a door you buy at Lowe's. If you need to replace the front door, you can't just buy a $300 door from Lowe's, because that would be a replacement item. What you have to do when it's historic is a reproduction item. You would have to go get a custom door builder to make a door true to the period. That's just part of the deal when you're in a historic district. So what do you think is going to cost more? Something that's a reproduction item or something that's just a replacement item? A reproduction is going to be an exact replica at today's prices. That's going to be usually more. Replacement cost is more commonly used than the reproduction cost because we're just estimating the value of putting in a door that works. When it's the cost approach, especially if it's a school or a church or something like that, a government building, the cost using modern materials and methods, that's going to be a lower cost than a reproduction cost. Unless we're specifically in a historic district, probably using the cost approach, we're going to estimate value with replacement cost. So now let's look at some methods here. The most common method of figuring out the value that an appraiser uses is the bottom one, square footage, cost per square foot. Anytime you talk to a builder, they like to talk in these terms too. A builder says things like, yeah, it costs $120 a square foot right now to build a new house, or probably they're going to say 160. And appraisers think in those terms as well. And that includes the basic cost of the lot too. But again, this is just pulling from air, just an idea. Cost per square foot, that's the big question. How much does it cost to build, but what are you putting it on, 10 acres or 1 acre? So that cost, I said it wrong. Cost per square foot is building the thing. Then you got to add in the value of the lot that you're going to build it on. Contractors look at it in a different way. A contractor versus an appraiser, what's the difference? The appraiser's telling you what it's worth. The contractor's the one who builds the thing, right? So the contractor is either going to think of it in terms of all of those raw materials. Have you ever driven by new construction and you see they just delivered the lumber and it's big old stacks of 2x4s and 2x6s, or maybe the trusses are out there in the mud and the dirt laying in the ground. Maybe it's a Sunday and they're not going to put them on until the coming week, and it's raining and you're like, gosh, I'm glad that's not my house. Well, a contractor is saying, what is each 2x4 worth? How much does each 2x4 cost? I think we're back up to, like, for an 8-foot one, I was just at Lowe's yesterday, like $5.50, something like that, depending on the quality of it. Thank goodness they got out of control there for a while. The contractor is going to estimate how much in raw materials and how much those things cost, plus how much they need to pay a crew to install it, put it all together. That's the quantity survey method. It's probably the method you would do if you just had to guess how to do something. Like if you were just going to build a little kids' play shed in the backyard, you'd say, well, let me see if it's worth my time and effort. How much am I going to have to pay to create and build this thing from scratch? Well, I gotta have at least probably 4 sheets of plywood, and I need to have a certain amount of 2x4s, and then there's nails, and I don't have a nailer, but that's a whole other issue. You're gonna make a list of the shingles and the building, and that's basically what we're talking about on a large scale. But then there's another method, because can you imagine if it's like this 300,000 foot building? You don't want to add up all of those. In that case, it's probably commercial. It's probably metal, 2x4s, metal studs. You don't want to add every line item of every single thing to figure out the value. So instead, the other one is called unit in place method. They're just saying, how much does it cost per unit of individual components? How much does it cost to put a foundation on a 100,000 foot building or a 3,000 foot house? How much is a foundation roughly? How much is the framing roughly? How much is the roof, the siding, and then the grading after the fact? All of those individual chunks. It makes me think of like a modular home, right? You're looking in terms of chunks of things, not each individual stick of lumber, etc. So both of those methods are what a contractor would use to figure out what something could cost. The square footage method is the appraiser method. That depreciation aspect in the cost approach. There's some words you need to know here. Physical deterioration. Can you fix it? Are physical repairs possible? Are they physically possible? Are they economically feasible? Is it even worth it to put the money in it? The house I live in now, if you remember, zoned industrial. Whoever buys it's going to put office buildings here. They're not going to need this house. They're going to tear the house down. I can't bring myself to spend $2,000 to replace the 40-year-old deck on the back of the house, even though it has waves in it like we're at the ocean. My dad built this thing literally 40 years ago. It's impressive that it's still standing. I don't walk on it too slowly. But I'm certainly not going to sink money into it right now. So can it be fixed? Yes. I could fix it. I could build a new one. It's curable. Curable means routine maintenance, painting, replacing the roof. Incurable means it's probably more expensive than it's worth doing. You're dealing with load-bearing walls. Now we're talking about big-ticket items. Anybody watch like Chip and Joanna Gaines or any of those flipping shows where they want to open up walls in an old house? You can't just knock the wall down. You got to go up into the attic and put the, what is it called? LVL beam, like the big laminated beam that's 20, 25 feet long. You got to put that up in there so it supports the load-bearing structure. Well, anytime you're dealing with load-bearing walls, it's expensive. Foundation work is expensive. A crack in a wall in the basement because water is coming off the roof too much, and maybe it's like one of those brick enclosed flower beds, and so water can't get away from the house. It's just soaking down in the ground, pushing against the basement wall, making it bend inward and crack. That's a big deal. That's several $1,000s. Incurable. So the difference between curable and incurable. That's physical deterioration. Adding up for physical deterioration to estimate the depreciation number. The next one is functional obsolescence. Outdated fixtures, outdated floor plans, plumbing, room conversions, garages that were turned into poorly done square footage, heated square feet. Those things are curable, though. You can put in black fixtures or weathered bronze instead of grandma looking brass from 1983. You can put a new toilet in there. Incurable is the harder things, the things that, again, too expensive to bother with. Is it a 5-bedroom house and only 1 bathroom? And the way the house is laid out is such that it would just be so expensive. You'd have to literally build an add-on to the house to put a bathroom in. And so it's not worth doing. Therefore, it's an incurable, functionally obsolete item. Or another one is that has no air conditioning because to install the ductwork that needs to be put in for the air system, it's just too expensive. This house I'm in, I keep picking on it. The attic space is not very tall. You kind of have to just be sitting and slide on your butt over the trusses up there. And it's not trusses, it was stick built, but it's no fun. And so to crawl, I put in new insulation when I moved back in here years ago. Got it from Lowe's and the big machine that blows it in. And so I had to crawl through on my belly all throughout that thing, blowing in insulation. I could just taste the asbestos. I'm just kidding. I'm sure it's not asbestos anymore. Um, but those sorts of things that make it too expensive. If I did it because it was my house, but if I had to pay somebody to do it, they would have charged me a ridiculous amount because nobody wants to do that to something that's not their house. They're going to make you pay for it. Economic depreciation means that's incurable. There is no cure to economic depreciation because it's proximity. You're near something that lowers the value. In the current CE class, they give a real world example of a lady who wants to sell her house and she's next door to a hog farm, raises pigs. Do you realize the constant bad smell involved there? So that's economic depreciation. If you were going to buy and build something next door to that, you can't do anything to change it. You just have to take less money for it because it's incurable. Or air traffic overhead because you're near the airport, or in my case, a landfill across the way. I'm not like right beside it, doesn't really affect me, but within about 7 minutes, I could go in those neighborhoods and they do have to sometimes deal with it. It's outside of the owner's control. So that's what economic depreciation. So here's the testable thing. Which type of depreciation is incurable, always incurable? The economic one, because it's outside of the control of the owner. But the other two, number 1 and 2 here, have both curable and incurable aspects. Depreciation, we can just have to subtract for that loss of value. There are two things that we do not depreciate. Clearly, we've depreciated everything from maintenance to roof to paint to plumbing and fixtures. You can depreciate in light of those things, floor plans. But what you cannot depreciate, number 1, is land. You don't depreciate land. That's why at the start of this little section, we set the land value apart before we did our depreciation math. We depreciated just the building. The other one is if it's your personal residence. We don't do depreciation on a personal residence. Let's go ahead and take our break. We'll come back. We will finish up with cost approach and get on into the income method. I'll see you in 10. back. Last half an hour, what, 50 minutes. 50 minutes to go, and then you're loose till next week. Oh, sorry. There we go. Thank you. I'm on vacation time. Are you ready? So two things that can't be depreciated: land and your personal residence. Let's talk about depreciation a little bit. Most appraisers, we're on page in your book 449, by the way, bottom of the page. Most appraisers use the breakdown method. That's where they have it divided into three separate classes, like we just saw: physical, functional, and economic depreciation, and estimate for curable versus incurable factors in each of those classes. Those classes that we just looked at, these ones, these three classes, that's what we're talking about. It's just harder to estimate. The older the building is, the harder it is to estimate depreciation. The easiest method is something called the age-life method. We're using the effective age of a building, plus its useful life. How much is it worth? The straight line method of appreciation means we're just determining the cost of that asset, and we're taking that depreciation, splitting it up evenly over whatever we're estimating its useful life to be, because depreciation is assumed to occur at an even rate over the property's economic life. What do I mean by economic life? Let's see on this slide here. Economic life is the period during which the property is expected to remain useful. That compared to its actual life. Actual life is it's just going to stay standing, but maybe it's not really usable, right? If you think about an abandoned school, maybe the buildings are all old. The economic life was maybe 50 years, but their buildings are still standing. In Concord, there's something called Jackson Training School. Or there's also in downtown Concord, Barba Scotia College, that has seen some times of being in action and some not. I think it's finally closed again, and so some of those buildings need to be renovated. Their actual life would be like 80 years, but how much of that life was economic life, useful, where they could be, if they needed to be used today, they would probably, some of those buildings like Jackson Training School would need significant money to renovate them. So economic life, useful life. Actual, think chronological. The straight line method of depreciation is taking an even rate over that useful life. An effective age is the age you're putting on a building depending on its condition and design. It's effectively how old. That's different than its actual age. And on the appraisal, the appraiser will say, I estimate the effective age of this building to be, and maybe the property is 20 years old, but because the owner has put in a new heating and air system, a new roof, updated the kitchen and the bathrooms, the actual age might be 25 years, but the effective age might only be 5 years or maybe 1 year old, because it's got a bunch of new stuff. They put a bunch of new things in it. So the appraiser is going to state the actual chronological age, but they're going to note if it's a significant difference between that and the upgrades, what the effective age is. The effective age is the more important one because it's the usable age, right? You don't care if it's 100 years old as long as it's got new stuff in it. The only thing that's 100 years old is the structure, and that's been checked and it's all good, but it doesn't have a 100-year-old heating system, thank goodness. It's got a new one. That's what you care more about. So straight line depreciation, that cost of the asset being depreciated evenly over its useful life. Annual depreciation is the property's cost divided by the number of years of its economic life. That's all under the cost approach. What are we using the cost approach for? Schools, churches, government buildings, fire stations, things that don't sell very often, things that are not income producing either. There's a special method for that we're going to cover in a minute. They're not sold very often, so we don't have a lot. We can't use the sales comparison method because we just don't have any others to compare to at any given time. It's always going to be the highest estimate of value because you're basing it off of the cost to build new. So cost approach out of the three methods, always going to be the highest. Now let's talk about investment property. Income capitalization approach, also known as the income approach. It's based on what we could say is the present worth of future rights to income. Future rights, rent. The present worth of the fact that you're going to be collecting rent over time. So what's that worth? What does that make it worth today? That this is an income producing property. It's more important about the income that's produced than the property itself. So while the house you might buy in the suburbs that's pretty and is owner occupied and maybe worth $400,000, compare that to the house you might buy in walking distance to the local university that's 30 years old and doesn't have the latest and greatest kitchen and bath. It all works. It's all fine, but it's just been rented forever and now it's on the market to be probably bought by someone who wants to put another renter in there. A guaranteed renter, because as long as you have a college, you're going to have students. It might be worth more than that prettier house because of that income, right? They're looking, the appraiser who's doing this income approach, they're looking at what makes an income property worth more. Proximity to the conveniences. What do people want to rent? They want to rent things that are near what they want to be close to. Conveniences, shopping centers, office buildings. So they're looking for that sort of thing. They're factoring that in. And that brings us to the equation. This equation, if you saw it in the chapter, hopefully it didn't freak you out any. It's what's more important is the relationship of these items than the actual equation itself. We're looking for how to relate gross income to net operating income. And so you can remember this little simple equation with the acronym given. I've color coded it to help you see what means what. GI in given means gross income. What does that mean? The most the structure, the building could possibly earn. Most it could possibly earn. Let's say it's a 100-unit apartment building. And you can rent each of those apartments for $2,000. What is the gross potential income for a 100-unit apartment building that you can get $2,000 per unit for? $200,000. There's our gross potential income. If we kept it completely occupied, if we had all 100 units rented out, that's what we would make. However, real life tells us that you're probably not going to have all 100 units occupied at any given moment. And an investor would probably tell you they kind of don't want to have them all occupied at any given moment because that would be a 100% occupancy. And when you have 100% occupancy, you have zero vacancy. See how that works? And what an investor would probably tell you is that if you have every unit rented, you're probably not charging enough rent. You want to charge just enough rent that some people aren't going to want to rent from you because you probably make more by renting out to 95 units at $2,300 than all 100 units at $2,000. Don't do that math. I didn't check it ahead of time, but that's the idea. Okay, I'm curious now. Let's see if I've backed into it accidentally being right. Okay, no. Let's pretend I didn't do that. So that's the idea. So, gross potential income, the absolute most you could possibly earn $200,000 in this case. That's the GI. Now we're going to subtract out for that vacancy rate. What's the vacancy rate? That's something you would learn from the financials of that. Because think about it. You're either a broker or an appraiser looking at the financial statement of this investment property, whether it's a duplex or a fourplex or a 100-unit apartment building or an office condo, office complex. And so let's say that it's a 4% vacancy rate. That means at any given time, you're averaging 4% of people either not paying the rent or you're having to pay money to send collections after them to collect because they're overdue, something like that. So you're losing money as an owner. You'd be losing money, 4%, toward vacancy and collections. And then what else do you know about real life? In your wherever you live, whether it's a house or an apartment or a basement or or a condo, you've got to pay rent. What else do you have to pay just to live there every month? You tell me. What are your expenses? You don't have to tell me the numbers, but the line items. Yeah, utilities. That's the big one. Expenses to live there. It costs to live. That's the big lesson learned between, high school and college and early 20s, late 20s. People stop paying for your stuff. So power, water, garbage, all of those expenses, operating expenses. When you subtract out for all that stuff, that leaves us with your net income. More specifically, the net operating income. Anybody ever heard of that term? Net operating income? You might have heard it called NOI. NOI, that's what an investor really wants to know. They don't care as much about the potential big number. They want to know, but how much does it cost to run this joint? What are the expenses? And if I'm going to buy it, are there any expenses that I could cut or get better rates of, lower, decrease somehow? Because by decreasing these expenses, I'm increasing what I'm left with. So NOI is basically what you're left with. It's a very common metric that an investor wants to see for a given property they're considering buying. So that gross income, the rent collected with a 100% occupancy, the vacancy rate, meaning how many are empty. When you subtract the vacancy rate from the gross income, you're left with an effective gross income, because you want to know how much you're getting for the 95 of the 100 units that are rented. Yes, sure, you know what you could be making if all 100, but what you really have are 95 of them, not 100. So how much are you making? That's the effective gross income. Now we're subtracting out expenses. Almost every expense except one is in this list. Look down through this list. Oh, well, I gave you the answer. Every expense, like taxes, insurance, management, maintenance, you might have to have if it's a 100-unit building, you might have an on-site person. You might have somebody housekeeping, right? Keeping the common areas. And then setting aside reserves for if things just blow up. You need to replace an air unit or a water heater sometime. Everything is included in this list of operating expenses except one thing. And that one thing is the debt service, mortgage. Remember, mortgage we call debt service? Why do we leave that out? Because the appraiser is going to assume that the owner or the purchaser is going to pay cash. It's none of their business what the purchaser is going to use to buy it. Are they going to leverage it with a loan, or are they going to pay cash? The NOI figure, net operating income, does not include the mortgage payment. That way you can compare apples to apples, different buildings, different potential, because if you're the investor, you're not just looking at this one property. You're looking at a bunch of different potential investment properties, and you want to be able to compare each of them. And if the current owner of this one you're looking at now has a mortgage, but the one down the street that you're also considering owns it completely outright, then if NOI included debt service, you wouldn't be able to really truly compare them. So that's why NOI does not include debt service. That way you can just leave that part out. Then it's up to you to decide, how do you want to buy it? Do you want to use all your cash? If you have all the cash, you may still not want to use it. Might be smarter to leverage yourself. Instead of using the entire $1 million you have in cash to own one property free and clear, maybe you'd rather own two properties with 50% loan to value ratios each. And that might be a better use of your money, right? So NOI lets you compare everything except the debt service. Now, NOI, net operating income, relates to the market value. What is this building worth? It's related to the market value by way of something called the capitalization rate. We've gone a little while without talking about a rate. We've talked about interest rates. We've talked about tax rates. And so here's another rate. If you've ever put your money, and you might still have some of your money, you have your money in a checking account, probably, from which you swipe your card and pay your bills. You might also have a savings account. Anybody have a savings account? How much interest are you earning on that savings account? Low enough that you're probably laughing about it. It's not, not enough. It's super safe, low risk, but it's not much. So the way you compare investments is with some sort of a rate of return. And the return on a savings account is not much, but the risk is also not much. The rate of return on Bitcoin is a whole other matter, isn't it? Or investing in like collectible cars or collectible guitars or motorcycles or real estate. So, or stocks, bonds, mutual funds. What's the rate of return on a fund of some sort or stock? That's how investors compare. Where do they want to park their money? Do they want to buy a stock, or do they want to put it in real estate? Other factors emerge as to why you'd pick one or the other. In real estate, the money is less liquid. They can't pull their money out as fast as if they had it in the stock market. But the capitalization rate is the rate that you can use to compare investments. It helps that investor see what the return on their investment is going to be. The cap rate is going to depend on the type of property it is. So if we're in the commercial sector of the market and you're maybe a specialist in office buildings, there's a guy, by the way, that I've had guest speak to some post-licensing classes before. His name is Michael Bull, like the animal. I'll put it in the chat here. Look him up on YouTube after class. And he's a commercial real estate broker, long time successful one. And most commercial people specialize in a nuanced sector of the market. You're not going to find many commercial brokers they'll help you with an office complex. They'll help you with an asphalt plant. They'll help you with a shopping center. They usually just pick a specialty and niche down. And his is office buildings, office complexes. I think what he told me in the Atlanta market a couple of years ago when we were talking about it, that's his thing, is office complexes there. And I believe the capitalization rate was around, I believe he said 6.5 or 7%. The reason cap rate matters to you in this class for this exam is because it, combined with the NOI, can give you an estimate of value. The cap rate is a rate of return that you're expecting from investing capital into this kind of building. So here's what it looks like. That cap rate is what happens when you take the NOI and divide it by the sales price. I like to look at it this other way a little better. there's our circle formula. So what can you find out if you're shopping for investment property? You're going to find out the NOI by looking at the financial statement. That's that top figure, NOI. You're going to get that just by saying, okay, could I see your financials? Tell me what your net operating income is. You're going to find out the cap rate from your research into similar properties, like Michael Bull telling me that his office buildings that he's involved with have a cap rate of 7%. Well, now that you know two things, you can divide NOI by cap rate to tell you how much you should be spending, not more than, to buy this property. So market value is affected by cap rate and NOI. You can use it as an indicator. You wouldn't want to spend more than whatever that math comes up. Or you just need to acknowledge that you're paying more than you might should, or as long as you're going to own it long enough, it doesn't matter. So that's the math. You do need to be able to do that. Just know that NOI divided by cap rate equals market value, where they're positioned in this circle formula. Note too that the bottom numbers in any of these circle formulas, as one of those bottom numbers goes up, the other one has to go down for it to stay the same, for this top number to be the same. So if the cap rate goes up from 7 to 8, that means the value is going to come down if the NOI stays the same. So like if you're looking at a building that has a net operating income of, let's say, $350,000, and you divide that by the cap rate of 7, that gives you an estimate of value of $5 million. Show you that on the calculator. There it is. We had our, what were my numbers? I said NOI. I totally forgot. There it is. 350. I said 350 for NOI divided by a cap rate of 7%. That gives us an estimate of market value. There's our 350 divided by 7 and the percent sign means that building is worth $5 million. What if you're not sure about the cap rate? You're seeing in your research that the cap rate is anywhere from 7 to 9%. Okay, well, let's see what happens if we do 9 instead of 7. That means if the cap rate is 9 instead of 7%, this building's only worth $3.8 million. So just know the relationship. As one goes up, the other's got to come down. And NOI, net operating income, related to that cap rate gives you an estimate of value, a market value. That's why it matters. That's why an investor cares about NOI, because they can back into an estimate of value. So we have our gross income. We subtract out for the vacancy, which also could include delinquency. That gives us our effective gross income. We now subtract those operating expenses because real life, utilities and whatnot. That gives us our NOI. And now we're going from a vertical. Oops, sorry, guys. Let me give you what I'm looking at. There it is. Gross income minus vacancy equals effective minus operating equals NOI. And now if we go horizontal, NOI divided by market value gives us the cap rate. So if we know what it's worth and we know the NOI, we can figure out the cap rate. That's how we are going to do research on things that have sold, similar investment properties, which we know what they sold for. If we already know what the market value was because we know that it sold for such and such, now we can use that information to figure out what to expect the cap rate to be for these kinds of properties. That's how Michael Bull knows that the cap rates of his specialty properties are 7%, because he knows what the NOIs were for things that have sold. He did this math, so he knows the range. And then you could flip these around. You could take NOI divided by cap rate on the subject property of the one you're thinking about buying. You don't know what it's worth. You need to figure that out. But what you do know is cap rates for properties like that tend to be 7%. You also know for that specific building from the financial statement that its NOI is whatever. Now you can do that division, tell you what you might be safe buying it for. Now, let's keep going. We stopped at NOI before. Let's keep going. The only thing left is to subtract the debt service. If they do have a loan, if you do want to choose to have a loan, mortgage instead of owning it free and clear, and you subtract that debt service from the NOI number, that brings us to the last item here, cash flow. I'm sure you've heard of cash flow. That's a major investor word. Cash flow is what you get after you subtract all of the expenses, including debt service. And then cash flow has its own horizontal calculation, sort of like NOI does. It's got the way that you can get to your rate of return. If you take your cash flow from the financials and divide it by how much you originally invest in the property to buy it, that gives you your return. Cash flow divided by original investment equals your equity rate of return. And now you can compare different potential investment properties. Let's see here. Here's what I want to do. So here's a problem. We have a gross income of $400,000 a year, a vacancy rate of 5%, operating expenses of $50,000 a year, debt service of $75,000 a year, and the cap rate that the investor wants to get is 8%, and their original investment is $100,000. With all of this information and the given formula and beyond, we can calculate both the NOI, the market value, and the equity rate of return. So let's just take it a step at a time. I know it looks intimidating. There's a lot of zeros, and it's a kind of a long-looking formula here. But if you just think of it in terms of common sense, I think it makes a little more sense. We take that gross income of $400,000. We subtract out the vacancy of, 5%? Yeah. And all we do to accomplish that is multiply 400,000 times 95%. That's going to build in, well, in this case, they figured out 5% and they subtracted it from the 400. You could do it either way. That gives us 380 estimated effective income. Now let's subtract out the operating expenses. They were $50,000 a year. When you take 50 from 380, that leaves us with 330 as the net operating income. If we subtract out that net operating income, keep on going, and take out the debt service of $75,000 in mortgage payments per year, that tells us our cash flow is $255. Now, let's take that NOI number of 330, and we know that the investor wants the cap rate to be 8%. Let me make a little note here. Our NOI is 330. They want an 8% cap rate. Oh, look, you can see it. Okay, good. And then if we take that 330 divided by that 8%, that gives us it's going to go right here, but I'm going to write it so you can see it in my normal little headshot screen there. $4,125,000. That's our estimate of market value using the NOI and that proposed cap rate that this investor wants to attain. So that's how we do it. Now let's do our cash flow number. Let's replace the NOI number with the cash flow, which was 255. This time we're going to divide that 255 by our original investment. Sorry, I got my slides mixed up. $2.55. So that's all you need to know to do there is NOI related to market value and cash flow related to equity rate of return. Something else to know is for a smaller rental property, smaller investment property, the gross rent multiplier method. Gross rent multiplier method. It's just sort of a shortcut way. It's not as involved as the given formula. It doesn't work for everything. It's just small residential properties. You wouldn't use it for a big apartment complex. You'd use it for a small duplex or a quad or triplex. And you're going to have a gross rent multiplier number that you've done research on and figured out. And so it relates to the rent. If you know the rent you can charge and that gross rent multiplier, it tells you up above there what you're safe paying for it. What would you be safe to pay for it? So that's all you need to know about the gross rent multiplier method. Let's see here. Sort of a recap. Don't average the approaches. Appraisers don't take the average of those three approaches. They reconcile depending on which approach the property is more like. The income capitalization method is for investment income property. Sales comparison we use for both single family and land. And the cost approach is for special purpose. The first step in the appraisal process, here's a good testable item. The first and last steps. The first step is to define the problem. The last step is to reconcile those various values. Come up with this is the appraiser, what they're doing. Come up with that ultimate market value that they're looking for. First step versus last step. Real Estate Commission, according to licensed law, says that yes, we do have to provide a written CMA to our clients. And that includes buyers. We're not just doing this for sellers. Buyer needs to know what they should be safe offering. Because again, the list price is the wish price. We don't know if they're even in the right ballpark for what they're asking. So when we prepare an offer, first step is to do a market analysis to see if their listing price is anywhere close to reasonable. So you're going to do CMAs for both your sellers and your buyers. Appraisers give, was that a question? No? Appraisers give value. Go ahead. No problem. Yeah, sure. That one? The steps. First step in the process of an appraisal being done is to define the problem. Last step is to reconcile the values in each of the approaches and determine which one and what the final market value should be. The appraisers give value, brokers give probable sales price. The appraiser's value is nothing but an opinion, right? It looks fancy, it looks like math and science, but it's really a lot of it has to do with that appraiser's feeling and knowledge of and guess of what a garage is worth or what a square foot is worth. Side note, provisional brokers, are you allowed to do CMAs? If you're a provisional broker, careful, I'm being tricky. CMA versus BPO, which one can a provisional broker do? Provisional broker, can you list property as a provisional broker? Can you take a listing and list something for sale and put it on the market? You bet. Sure you can. Go for it. Therefore, the thing that you do associated with listing a property is called the CMA. That is what you can do because you don't charge money for the CMA. The CMA is one of many, many things you do as part of the process of listing the property. So a provisional broker is allowed to do a CMA, but they're not allowed to do a BPO when it's for compensation. We say maybe they could do a BPO for free, but they can't get paid for it until they're non-provisional. But that CMA is part of your agency services, part of our fee. It's not extra. Once you're a full broker, non-provisional broker, now you can do BPOs for money. But then there are some cases where you still cannot do BPOs even if you're a full broker. A BPO cannot replace an appraisal if it's for making a loan or doing a refinance or anytime the law requires that an appraisal be used. So finally, true or false, doing a CMA BPO, knowing how to do it, not that big a deal. Just look at the market trends. True or false? Real Estate Commission says it is a big deal. You could get disciplined for doing this wrong or not doing it all. We need to have proof in the file, right? We need to keep, how long do we need to keep our records for, by the way? $3 years. Good job. That's everything, including the CMA for both buyers and sellers. You should have that CMA in there showing proof that you told them what their probable sale price might be, but also what a good offer price might be. Let's look at this, and then we'll wind down. Oh, goodness. There we go. That's what I wanted. So a couple more things here. That gross rent multiplier, by the way, if a property, and this is pulling straight from your book, page 457, if a property sold recently for $82,000 and the monthly rental income was $650, the gross rent multiplier would come from those numbers. So it would look like this. The value, market value, sale price, however you want to say it, gross rent multiplier, that's a rate. So rates go on the bottom, and then the other thing on the bottom is the rent. So in this case, we would take that 82,000 divided by the 650, which would tell us that the gross rent multiplier for properties like these is 126.2. If you did this for 4 or 5 similar properties, maybe you'd find a gross rent multiplier ranging around that 126 range. Now, if you go on a listing appointment and you know what tends to be the gross rent multiplier for properties like this, and that owner says, I'm thinking about selling this, I'm tired of being a property manager. You could say, well, how much do you charge in rent? And he could say, well, I've had a renter there for a long time, and I charge him $550. So you would use that 126.2. And if 550 was really truly all you could get out of it, that would tell you that the rough estimate of value is $69,000. But then you would probably ask questions like, why are you letting them pay you $550? Have you raised the rent? Are you thinking about raising it? Do you think a new owner could raise the rent? And you would do your own research. As a broker, you'd look up rentals and see, and you might realize that this guy's shorting himself. He could probably get $675, maybe $700. What if he got $700 instead of $550? $700 times that 126.2 means that the property is worth $88,000. So you would value the property not on what he's currently charging, but what maybe he could be charging. Maybe he's charging less because he likes the people. But a stranger, a new owner to a brand new tenant, once this current tenant's lease is up, might charge more. And therefore, let's base it on that rather than the special case here. You've got some practice problems about comparable sales that I would suggest you go through. Page 455 is where they start. And what else? Let's see here. There's an income capitalization approach breakdown on page 452. There's another rent multiplier on 453, and they give you different comps with different sale prices and different monthly rents showing the different gross rent multipliers. So I'd spend some time on that. And let's see what's next. We're done with valuation. The next in line, let me take a look before we head out. Next thing we've got coming up is insurance. So that'll be the next one, unit 13 in the book. And then we've got a bunch next week we'll pretty much get all of these things done. And that will put us to the point where we're going to be reviewing. We've done most of license law and commission rule, so we're going to review that. And don't forget my 2 YouTube channels that have videos on the math. The Impact Broker Coach has every math walkthrough laid out for you. It's just probably easy to, hit pause and think about it and take your time with it. With that said, Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays. Here's 7 minutes as my gift to you. And I wish you a safe weekend, and I will see you next week. Put your name in the chat for me. You're welcome. Merry Christmas. Take care.